4 life sentences crashed down upon Henry Wilson with the same brutal finality that he had delivered to 3 innocent teenagers found strangled in the desert. What no one expected was that the trail of murders would unravel because of a burner phone with only one number ever dialed, a phone the killer had deliberately left with his final victim as his signature. That single clue would become the digital fingerprint that exposed a predator hiding in plain sight. Henry Wilson was sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences for the brutal murders of 3 teenagers in Phoenix, Arizona, ending a reign of terror that had gripped the city for nearly 2 months. The victims, 17-year-old Gabriella Martinez, 16-year-old Tyler Adams, and 15-year-old Michelle Thompson, were all found strangled and carefully arranged in remote desert locations on the outskirts of Phoenix. Their bodies had been positioned with unsettling precision, hands folded across their chests, shoes removed and placed neatly beside them, in what investigators would later describe as ritualistic displays of control. The first body was discovered on June 3rd, when early morning hikers stumbled upon the remains of Tyler Adams in a secluded wash approximately 20 miles outside the Phoenix city limits. His parents had reported him missing 3 days earlier when he failed to return home from a study session at the East Valley Community College Library, where he had been preparing for final exams. The medical examiner determined Tyler had been strangled with a thin cord or wire that left distinctive marks around his neck, suggesting the killer had approached from behind and used significant force to subdue the athletic teenager. The body showed no signs of sexual assault, but Tyler's personal effects had been meticulously arranged beside him, his wallet emptied of cash, but ID cards left intact, his cell phone missing, and his backpack containing school materials placed under his head like a macabre pillow. The discovery sent immediate shock waves through Phoenix, a city already grappling with seasonal tensions as temperatures climbed well above 100 degrees in the early summer heat. Local news coverage was extensive, with parents across the metropolitan area suddenly imposing strict curfews and accompanying their teenagers to previously routine activities. Detective Marcus Davis of the Phoenix Police Department's Homicide Unit took lead on the investigation, telling reporters only that they were pursuing all available leads, while privately admitting to colleagues that evidence was frustratingly sparse. The remote location had yielded few usable forensics, with the extreme desert heat accelerating decomposition and compromising potential biological evidence that might have been left at the scene. Just 11 days later, as the investigation into Tyler's murder was still developing, 15-year-old Michelle Thompson disappeared while walking home from a friend's house in the Arcadia neighborhood, less than 2 miles from her family's home. Michelle's mother became alarmed when her daughter failed to respond to text messages, and she immediately reported the girl missing after calling her daughter's friends and discovering she had left for home over an hour earlier. The search for Michelle was extensive, involving dozens of officers, K-9 units, and community volunteers who combed the residential neighborhoods and adjacent desert areas for any sign of the teenager. Despite these efforts, her body wasn't discovered until 2 days after her disappearance, when a maintenance worker found her remains in a dry irrigation channel behind an abandoned property on the eastern edge of Phoenix. The similarities between the 2 crime scenes were immediate and disturbing, prompting Phoenix police to form a task force dedicated to what they now recognized as the work of a serial killer operating in their city. Like Tyler, Michelle had been strangled with what appeared to be the same type of cord, her body positioned in the same formal manner, and her belongings arranged with the same disturbing attention to detail. The medical examiner noted the killer had shown increasing confidence and precision, with less evidence of struggle than in the first murder. Phoenix Mayor Sandra Reynolds held a press conference urging citizens to remain vigilant while assuring them that every resource available was being dedicated to apprehending the person responsible. Schools across the city implemented emergency security protocols, with many canceling extracurricular activities and offering remote learning options for students too frightened to attend classes. As July began, Phoenix found itself transformed from a typical summer of swimming pools and evening barbecues to a city under siege where parents shadowed their children and teenagers moved in nervous groups. The relentless desert heat, which normally drove residents indoors to air-conditioned sanctuaries during daylight hours, now seemed to intensify the sense of vulnerability as families remained clustered together even in the scorching temperatures. Local gun sales spiked dramatically, and self-defense classes reported record enrollments as citizens sought ways to protect themselves against an invisible threat. The city's usual summer exodus of residents seeking cooler climates accelerated, with those who could afford to leave the area doing so, citing safety concerns for their teenage children. Detective Davis and his team worked around the clock, analyzing surveillance footage from businesses near both disappearance sites and interviewing dozens of potential witnesses. They established that both victims had connections to East Valley Community College, Tyler as a high school student taking advanced placement courses there, and Michelle as a participant in a summer science program hosted on campus. This tenuous connection became the first solid lead, suggesting the killer might have ties to the college, or at least used it as a hunting ground for potential victims. Campus security footage from the days surrounding both disappearances was reviewed exhaustively, but the sheer volume of people moving through the busy community college made identification of suspicious individuals nearly impossible without more specific parameters. The investigation's focus on the community college brought limited progress until forensics revealed fibers on both victims' clothing that matched a specific brand of industrial cleaning product used exclusively by maintenance staff at certain municipal and educational facilities in Maricopa County. This discovery narrowed the suspect pool considerably, and investigators began compiling a list of maintenance workers, janitors, and facilities staff who had access to both the college campus and the areas where the bodies had been discovered. The list initially contained over 60 individuals, but was gradually refined based on work schedules, proximity to the crime scenes, and criminal background checks. Each person on the list was placed under discreet surveillance while deeper background investigations were conducted, stretching the department's resources to their limits. 26 days after the discovery of the first body, with Phoenix still reeling from the first two murders, 17-year-old Gabriella Martinez vanished while returning from a volunteer shift at a local animal shelter. Gabriella, known to friends and family as Gabby, had texted her mother that she was boarding a city bus for the 30-minute ride home, but she never arrived. The bus driver later confirmed that Gabriella had exited the bus at her regular stop just 3 blocks from her family's apartment in central Phoenix. Security cameras from a convenience store on the corner captured her walking toward home, but she disappeared somewhere in the 2-block stretch between that final sighting and her residence. Her parents, both immigrants who worked multiple jobs to support their daughter's college aspirations, immediately contacted police when she failed to arrive by her expected time. Given the pattern established by the previous murders, law enforcement responded with unprecedented speed, deploying search teams throughout central Phoenix and issuing an emergency alert to all residents within a 5-mile radius of Gabriella's last known location. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging scanned the urban landscape and surrounding desert areas, while plainclothes officers saturated bus routes and transportation hubs across the city. Despite these extraordinary measures, there was no sign of Gabriella for nearly 36 hours, creating a painful limbo for her family and the community. The media coverage was intense, with national news networks now reporting on the Phoenix teenager killer, and questioning whether law enforcement had done enough to protect the city's young people after the first two murders. On the morning of July 30th, a retired couple walking their dog in a remote area of South Mountain Park discovered Gabriella's body in a shallow arroyo, partially concealed by desert brush, but arranged in the now familiar position, hands folded, shoes placed neatly beside her, personal items arranged with precision. The discovery site was the most remote yet, accessible only by a service road rarely used except by park maintenance vehicles, suggesting the killer had intimate knowledge of the area and potentially access to restricted locations. Like the previous victims, Gabriella had been strangled with the same type of cord, but this time the killer had left something new. Clutched in her right hand was an inexpensive burner phone that would ultimately become the key to unraveling the entire case. Gabriella Martinez was born in Phoenix to parents who had immigrated from Mexico just 2 years before her birth, seeking opportunities they believed could provide a better future for their children. Her father, Roberto Martinez, worked as a landscaper for a company serving the affluent neighborhoods of Paradise Valley, often spending 12-hour days under the scorching Arizona sun to provide for his family. Her mother, Elena Martinez, cleaned houses during the day and worked evening shifts at a local laundromat, the family's small apartment often empty until late in the evening when they would finally gather for a late dinner and share stories from their day. Despite the financial challenges they faced, the Martinez home was filled with love, laughter, and unwavering support for their children's education, which they viewed as the pathway to a life less defined by constant struggle. From an early age, Gabriella showed exceptional academic promise, reading well above her grade level and displaying a natural aptitude for mathematics and science that impressed her teachers. By middle school, she had set her sights on becoming a doctor, motivated by an experience when her younger brother, Miguel, had broken his arm, and the family had delayed seeking medical care due to concerns about the cost. The kindness of the emergency room physician who had eventually treated Miguel, along with the physician's explanation of the fracture in terms Gabriella could understand, had sparked something in her, a desire to heal others and perhaps one day provide care to families like her own who often existed on the margins of the healthcare system. This dream became her North Star, guiding her academic choices and extracurricular activities throughout high school. At Desert Vista High School, Gabriella maintained a perfect 4.0 grade point average while participating in the Health Occupation Students of America Club, volunteering at a local animal shelter, and working weekend shifts at a neighborhood pharmacy to save money for college. Her advanced placement biology teacher, Dr. Sophia Chen, would later tell investigators that Gabriella was the kind of student who comes along once in a teaching career, brilliant, compassionate, and driven by something deeper than just grades or college admissions. Dr. Chen had written Gabriella a glowing recommendation for a prestigious summer medical internship program at the University of Arizona, which Gabriella was scheduled to begin just 2 weeks after her murder. The acceptance letter for this program was found in her backpack at the crime scene, carefully folded and placed in a protective plastic sleeve, a poignant reminder of the future that had been stolen from her. Friends described Gabriella as serious about her studies, but also full of humor and warmth, someone who remembered birthdays, offered homework help without being asked, and somehow always found time to attend her friends' sporting events or music recitals despite her packed schedule. Her best friend since elementary school, Daniela Suarez, told police that Gabriella had been excited but nervous about the upcoming internship, spending hours researching medical terminology and reading journal articles to prepare herself. In her final text message to Daniela on the day she disappeared, Gabriella had written, "Heading home from the shelter, Mom's making enchiladas tonight and I'm starving. Call you later about the bio review session tomorrow?" This ordinary message, so full of normal teenage concerns and simple pleasures, would become a haunting reminder of how suddenly her life had been cut short. The Martinez family's modest two-bedroom apartment in Central Phoenix was filled with evidence of Gabriella's achievements: academic awards displayed proudly on the living room wall, a bookshelf overflowing with medical texts and science fiction novels, and a corkboard above her desk covered with college brochures, scholarship applications, and inspirational quotes. Elena Martinez showed detectives her daughter's prized possession, a genuine stethoscope gifted to her by their family doctor on her 16th birthday, which Gabriella kept in a special case beside her bed. The room also contained a glass jar labeled Medical School Fund, half filled with bills and coins that Gabriella had been saving since freshman year, each contribution representing hours of work and deferred small pleasures in service of her long-term goal. When Gabriella failed to return home on that fateful July evening, her parents immediately sensed something was wrong, as their daughter was meticulously reliable about communicating her whereabouts and never missed family dinner without advance notice. Roberto Martinez drove the route from the bus stop to their apartment repeatedly in the family's aging sedan, while Elena called Gabriella's friends and checked with local businesses along the path her daughter would have walked. Their growing panic as night fell was compounded by a language barrier when they first contacted police, though a Spanish-speaking officer eventually took their report with the seriousness it deserved. During the agonizing 36 hours before Gabriella's body was discovered, the Martinez apartment became a gathering place for extended family, neighbors, and Gabriella's friends, all clinging to hope that somehow she would return safely. The news of Gabriella's death devastated not only her immediate family, but the entire community that had watched her grow and flourish against considerable odds. Her younger brother Miguel, just 13 years old, withdrew into silence after learning of his sister's murder, unable to process the loss of his greatest advocate and protector. In the days following the discovery of her body, more than 500 people attended a candlelight vigil held in the courtyard of Desert Vista High School, where classmates, teachers, and even strangers moved by her story shared memories and expressed collective grief. Principal James Henderson announced the establishment of the Gabriella Martinez Memorial Scholarship, which would annually provide financial support to a graduating senior pursuing a career in medicine, ensuring that her dream would live on through others, even as her own journey had been cut tragically short. The media coverage of Gabriella's murder differed subtly from that of the previous victims, with reporters highlighting her academic achievements, volunteer work, and the obstacles she had overcome as the child of immigrants pursuing the American dream. Local television stations aired segments featuring interviews with her teachers and mentors, all of whom spoke of her exceptional potential and the profound loss her death represented not only to her family but to the medical field she had hoped to enter. This narrative resonated deeply with the Phoenix community, and as details of the other victims emerged, it became clear that the killer had targeted not just any teenagers, but specifically those who represented promise, ambition, and future contributions to society. Tyler Adams, the first victim, had been a talented baseball player being scouted by several Division I colleges with a particular gift for mathematics that had earned him a spot in the advanced placement program at East Valley Community College. Michelle Thompson, the second victim, was a gifted cellist who had recently been accepted to a prestigious summer music program and volunteered teaching music to elementary school children in underfunded districts. Each victim represented potential cut short, dreams extinguished before they could be realized, leaving behind not just grieving families, but communities diminished by their absence. This pattern would later prove significant in understanding the killer's psychology and motivation, as prosecutors built their case around his apparent resentment of youthful achievement and promise. In the Martinez household, Gabriella's bedroom remained untouched for months after her death, a shrine to the daughter whose absence left an unfillable void. Elena Martinez continued to launder and fold her daughter's clothes each week, unable to bring herself to donate or discard any tangible connection to Gabriella. Roberto Martinez channeled his grief into activism, joining with the families of Tyler Adams and Michelle Thompson to advocate for increased safety measures around public transportation and educational facilities throughout Phoenix. The three families, united by unimaginable tragedy, formed a support network that transcended their different backgrounds and circumstances, finding in each other the rare understanding that can only come from shared experience of such a specific and devastating loss. As the criminal case against Henry Wilson progressed, the Martinez family attended every court proceeding, often arriving hours early to secure seats in the courtroom where they could look directly at the man accused of taking their daughter's life. They sat with quiet dignity through graphic testimony about Gabriella's final moments, through defense attempts to humanize her killer, and through the painful display of evidence, including her personal belongings, recovered from the crime scene. When asked by reporters why they subjected themselves to this additional trauma, Roberto Martinez replied simply, "We must bear witness for Gabriella because she cannot speak for herself anymore." Their unwavering presence became a powerful reminder of the human cost of Wilson's actions, a silent testament to justice that resonated with both the jury and the wider community following the case. The tragedy of Gabriella Martinez extended beyond the personal loss to her family and friends, becoming emblematic of larger societal failures to protect vulnerable young people, particularly those from marginalized communities. Community advocates noted that the bus route Gabriella had been taking had previously been flagged as potentially unsafe due to poor lighting and minimal security cameras, yet budget constraints had prevented recommended improvements from being implemented. Following her death, the City Council unanimously approved emergency funding for enhanced safety measures along all public transportation routes used by students, a bittersweet victory that came too late for Gabriella but would potentially save others. Her story became a catalyst for broader conversations about urban planning, public safety, and the protection of young people navigating public spaces, ensuring that her impact would continue long after her life had ended. The discovery of Gabriella Martinez's body in South Mountain Park triggered an immediate and comprehensive response from law enforcement, with the crime scene secured within minutes of the 911 call from the retired couple who had found her. Detective Marcus Davis arrived at the scene within 30 minutes, already grimly aware that this was likely the third victim of what the department had internally dubbed the academic achiever killings. The location, a shallow arroyo, accessible only by a seldom-used service road winding through the rocky terrain of Phoenix's largest desert preserve, immediately struck Davis as significant, suggesting the killer's familiarity with remote areas that would temporarily conceal his victims while ensuring they would eventually be found. A full crime scene unit was deployed with technicians meticulously documenting every aspect of the scene before disturbing any evidence, knowing that prosecutor Katherine Mitchell would need an airtight case if they managed to identify a suspect. The initial examination revealed the now familiar pattern. Gabriella had been strangled with a thin cord, her body carefully arranged with hands folded across her chest and her shoes placed neatly beside her. Her backpack containing school materials, identification, and the acceptance letter to the medical internship program was positioned under her head, while her wallet had been emptied of cash, but her credit cards and ID remained untouched. The medical examiner's preliminary assessment indicated she had been killed approximately 24 to 36 hours before discovery, consistent with the timeline of her disappearance. Unlike the previous victims, however, Gabriella's right hand had been positioned to hold a small, inexpensive burner phone, a deliberate placement that crime scene technicians immediately recognized as significant, given that her own smartphone was missing from her possessions. "This is new," Davis remarked to his partner as they observed the crime scene technician carefully photographing and bagging the burner phone. "He's evolving, trying to tell us something or leaving a signature." The phone, a basic model available at convenience stores and requiring no contract or identification to purchase, was handled with extreme care, as it represented the first substantial physical evidence not present at the previous crime scenes. Davis immediately requested priority processing for the device, recognizing that in the digital age, even the most careful criminals often left electronic footprints that could be traced. He also ordered an expanded search of the surrounding area, theorizing that the killer might have discarded other evidence while entering or leaving the remote location. As Gabriella's body was carefully removed from the scene for transport to the medical examiner's office, Davis stood at the edge of the arroyo, surveying the harsh desert landscape that stretched in every direction. The July heat was oppressive, the temperature already climbing past 100 degrees despite the early morning hour, and he noted the significant physical effort it would have required to transport a body to this isolated location. The killer was either very strong or very determined, possibly both, and the choice of such a remote site suggested increasing confidence in his ability to avoid detection. Davis also observed that the nearest parking area was nearly half a mile away, meaning the killer had either carried or dragged Gabriella's body a considerable distance over rough terrain, further indicating physical capability and knowledge of the park's layout. Back at Phoenix Police Headquarters, the burner phone was immediately submitted to the Digital Forensics Lab, where technician Sarah Jenkins began the meticulous process of extracting any available data. Her preliminary report, delivered to Detective Davis just 4 hours later, contained the first significant break in the case. The phone contained only one contact and showed evidence of only one call ever being made from the device. "This isn't the victim's phone that somehow ended up in her hand," Jenkins explained to the assembled investigative team. "This phone was purchased, used to make a single call to another prepaid number, and then deliberately placed with the victim as some kind of message or signature." The discovery sent a ripple of tension through the room as the implications became clear. The killer was not only aware of the investigation, but was now actively communicating with law enforcement through his crime scenes. The medical examiner's preliminary report confirmed what the investigators had suspected. Gabriella Martinez had been killed in the same manner as the previous victims, with the same type of cord used for strangulation. Time of death was estimated at between 8 and 12 hours after her disappearance, suggesting she had been held somewhere before being killed. There were no signs of sexual assault, but defensive wounds on her hands and forearms indicated she had fought her attacker, potentially providing DNA evidence under her fingernails. Soil samples taken from her clothing did not match the location where her body was found, suggesting she had been killed elsewhere and transported to South Mountain Park post-mortem. This detail was kept from the media to preserve the integrity of the investigation, as only the killer would know that the murder location differed from the disposal site. While the forensics team processed physical evidence, Detective Davis focused on the single call made from the burner phone found with Gabriella. The call had been placed at 9:27 p.m. on the night of her disappearance, approximately 2 hours after she was last seen leaving the bus. The recipient was another prepaid phone, creating significant challenges for tracking, but cell tower data could at least provide a general location where the receiving phone had been at the time of the call. Working with the mobile service provider, investigators determined that the receiving phone had pinged a tower near East Valley Community College, the institution connected to all 3 victims. This geographic correlation strengthened the theory that the killer had some association with the college, potentially as staff rather than faculty or student, given the industrial cleaning fibers found on previous victims. The task force established a dedicated room for the investigation, with walls covered in photos of the victims, maps showing the locations of disappearances and body discoveries, and timelines detailing every known movement of Tyler, Michelle, and Gabriella before they vanished. Detective Davis briefed his team on the latest findings, emphasizing the significance of the burner phone. "This isn't just evidence, it's communication," he told the assembled officers. "He's proud of what he's doing and wants us to know something about him or his methods." The team debated the meaning behind the phone's placement. Was it a taunt, suggesting the killer could reach out to his victims without being traced? Was it symbolic of disconnection or isolation? Or was it simply a mistake, an unintentional clue left by a perpetrator growing overconfident with each successful murder? As these questions were being debated, the forensics team made another crucial discovery: a partial fingerprint on the inside of the burner phone's battery compartment. While the exterior of the phone had been wiped clean, the killer had apparently opened the device at some point, perhaps to ensure the battery was charged or to remove the SIM card after making the call, and had left a small but potentially identifiable print on the internal component. This evidence was immediately fast-tracked for analysis, though investigators remained cautiously optimistic, knowing that the print might be partial or smudged beyond usefulness. They also began the process of obtaining surveillance footage from convenience stores and electronics retailers throughout Phoenix, focusing on locations that sold the specific brand and model of burner phone found with Gabriella. 48 hours into the investigation of Gabriella's murder, Detective Davis received the results of the cell tower analysis for the receiving phone, the one that had been called from the burner found with Gabriella's body. The report indicated that this second phone had been consistently pinging towers in a triangular pattern between East Valley Community College, an apartment complex in Tempe, and a warehouse district in South Phoenix over the 2-week period preceding Gabriella's disappearance. This pattern suggested routine movement between these locations, potentially indicating the killer's home, workplace, and hunting ground. Investigators immediately began cross-referencing this geographic pattern with employment records from the college, focusing particularly on maintenance and facility staff who might live in the Tempe area. The partial fingerprint from inside the burner phone provided limited but potentially valuable information. While not complete enough for a definitive identification, forensic analysts determined it belonged to an adult male with no criminal record in the national database. This narrowed the focus to individuals without prior arrests, eliminating some suspects, but still leaving a substantial pool of potential perpetrators. More promising was the surveillance footage collected from convenience stores selling the specific model of burner phone, which detectives were systematically reviewing, looking for single males purchasing these devices in the weeks before Gabriella's murder. The tedious process of viewing hundreds of hours of grainy footage from dozens of stores represented the painstaking reality of detective work, far removed from the glamorized portrayal in television crime dramas. The investigation received another boost when analysis of Gabriella's fingernail scrapings yielded trace amounts of DNA not belonging to the victim. While insufficient for a complete profile, the sample contained enough markers to potentially confirm a match if a suspect was identified through other means. Additionally, microscopic fibers found on Gabriella's clothing matched those from the previous victims, confirming the same perpetrator and providing further evidence of a connection to industrial cleaning products used at East Valley Community College. These forensic links, while not immediately leading to a suspect, helped prosecutors build the foundation for an eventual case, establishing the connection between all 3 murders beyond reasonable doubt. As the first week of investigation into Gabriella's murder concluded, Phoenix remained a city gripped by fear, with parents still accompanying their teenagers everywhere and public spaces noticeably emptier despite the peak summer season. Mayor Reynolds held daily press briefings attempting to balance the community's right to information against the investigators' need to withhold certain details. The families of all three victims appeared together at a community forum, their shared grief transcending the different neighborhoods, socioeconomic backgrounds, and ethnicities they represented. Roberto Martinez, speaking softly through an interpreter, made a plea that resonated throughout the city. The monster who took our children believes he is smarter than all of us together. He is wrong. Someone knows him. Someone has seen something. For Gabriella, for Tyler, for Michelle, please come forward. The breakthrough in the investigation came from an unlikely source, a gas station convenience store on the outskirts of Tempe, where a diligent clerk named Ravinder Patel had noticed a customer purchasing multiple prepaid phones over several weeks. Unlike the larger chain stores with automated checkout systems, Patel's family-owned business maintained old-fashioned service practices, with the clerk handling each transaction personally. Detective Davis and his partner interviewed Patel after his store appeared on a list of retailers selling the specific brand of burner phone found with Gabriella Martinez. "I remember this guy because he always paid cash and never wanted a receipt," Patel told the detectives, describing a white male in his late 20s or early 30s who typically visited during the early morning hours. "He bought 3 phones from me in the past month, always the same cheap model, always with cash, always seeming nervous." This potential lead became substantially more promising when Patel mentioned that his store had recently upgraded its security system, installing high-definition cameras with enhanced nighttime capabilities after a series of beer thefts earlier in the year. The footage from these cameras, covering the time frame when the burner phone found with Gabriella had likely been purchased, provided investigators with clear images of a slender white male wearing a gray East Valley Community College Maintenance Department baseball cap. The timestamp showed the purchase occurring 4 days before Gabriella's disappearance, and the customer paid with cash pulled from a wallet that appeared to contain multiple bills, potentially connecting to the cash missing from all 3 victims' wallets. Detective Davis immediately ordered enhanced analysis of the footage and requested all employment records from the community college's facilities and maintenance departments. The maintenance department at East Valley Community College employed 47 individuals, including janitors, groundskeepers, HVAC technicians, and various repair specialists. Cross-referencing this employee list with the geographic triangle established by the cell phone tower, data narrowed the focus to 12 employees who lived in the general vicinity of the Tempe apartment complex where the receiving burner phone had frequently pinged. From these 12, investigators identified 4 white males between the ages of 25 and 35 who physically resembled the man in the gas station surveillance footage. Background checks on these individuals revealed that one of them, 27-year-old Henry Wilson, had been employed by the college for just under 2 years and lived in an apartment complex directly adjacent to the tower that had registered the most frequent pings from the receiving burner phone. Wilson's employment file contained several red flags that immediately captured the investigators' attention. He had received 2 written warnings for inappropriate interactions with students, though the documentation was frustratingly vague about the specific nature of these incidents. His supervisor had noted that Wilson was highly competent but difficult to supervise, and prefers to work alone, especially in areas of campus with minimal foot traffic. Most significantly, his work schedule showed him assigned to maintenance duties in the library, where Tyler Adams had last been seen, and the science building where Michelle Thompson had participated in summer programs. Detective Davis obtained a photograph of Wilson from his employee ID and compared it to the gas station footage, noting the strong resemblance in physical build, posture, and facial features, though the gas station customer had worn a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. Armed with this circumstantial evidence but lacking definitive proof connecting Wilson to the murders, investigators began surveillance of his apartment and workplace, hoping to observe behaviors that might strengthen their case or provide probable cause for a search warrant. A team of plainclothes officers monitored Wilson's movements for 72 hours, reporting that his routine was remarkably consistent. He left his apartment each morning at precisely 6:45, stopped at the same drive-through coffee shop, arrived at the college by 7:30, worked until 4 in the afternoon, and then returned directly home. The only deviation in this pattern occurred on Tuesday evenings, when he visited a laundromat despite his apartment complex having on-site laundry facilities, a detail that investigators flagged as potentially significant given the cleaning product fibers found on the victims. While physical surveillance continued, digital forensic specialists obtained a court order for Wilson's cell phone records, credit card statements, and internet service provider data. The cell phone records proved particularly illuminating, showing that Wilson's personal phone had been in the vicinity of all 3 body disposal locations around the estimated times when the bodies were placed there. Additionally, his internet search history, obtained through a separate warrant served on his provider, revealed disturbing patterns: searches for Phoenix teenager murders, how police trace prepaid phones, and desert locations near Phoenix with minimal foot traffic. Though none of these searches explicitly confessed to murder, the pattern and timing strongly suggested Wilson's involvement and provided the additional evidence needed for a more comprehensive search warrant. Judge Maria Ramirez reviewed the accumulated evidence and granted a search warrant for both Wilson's apartment and his vehicle, a 10-year-old white Ford Ranger pickup truck that had been observed during surveillance. Detective Davis assembled a tactical team to execute the warrant during Wilson's work hours, ensuring that the suspect would not be present and potentially destroy evidence if alerted to the investigation. The search of Wilson's sparsely furnished one-bedroom apartment yielded several key pieces of evidence: a drawer containing 3 additional burner phones of the same model found with Gabriella, a coil of thin nylon cord matching the ligature marks on all 3 victims, and a locked metal box hidden in the air vent of his bathroom. This box, opened with a key found on Wilson's keyring seized during a subsequent search of his workplace locker, contained driver's licenses belonging to all 3 victims, along with other personal items taken from them, including Tyler's class ring, Michelle's silver bracelet, and Gabriella's university acceptance letter. Perhaps most damning was a journal discovered between Wilson's mattress and box spring, containing detailed entries dating back more than a year before the first murder. The entries revealed a mind consumed by resentment toward privileged teenagers and academic elites, with increasingly specific references to students at East Valley Community College whom Wilson encountered during his maintenance work. An entry dated 2 weeks before Tyler Adams's murder read, "They don't even see me. I fix their broken water fountains, clean their spills, repair the air conditioning that keeps them comfortable, and I'm invisible. But soon one of them will see me. They'll have no choice." Later entries described detailed surveillance of specific students, including all 3 victims, with notes about their routines, vulnerabilities, and the lesson their deaths would teach to a society that values the wrong things. The search of Wilson's pickup truck provided the final pieces needed to complete the case against him. Forensic technicians discovered trace blood evidence in the truck bed that preliminary testing matched to Gabriella Martinez, along with soil samples consistent with all 3 body disposal locations. A hidden compartment beneath the passenger seat contained a collection of newspaper clippings about the murders, a map of Phoenix with the 3 body disposal locations circled in red ink, and a handwritten list titled potentials with 7 additional names, presumably intended future victims. Among the items recovered was also a receipt from the gas station where Ravinder Patel worked, dated 3 days before Gabriella's disappearance, corroborating the surveillance footage that had initially led investigators to Wilson. With this overwhelming physical evidence in hand, Detective Davis obtained an arrest warrant for Henry Wilson on 3 counts of first-degree murder. Rather than creating a potentially dangerous situation by attempting to arrest Wilson at his apartment, the tactical team planned to take him into custody at East Valley Community College, where his movements were predictable and the environment could be controlled. On August 12th, 13 days after the discovery of Gabriella Martinez's body, Wilson was approached by plainclothes officers as he repaired an air conditioning unit in an unoccupied classroom. He offered no resistance when informed he was under arrest, his expression betraying no surprise or emotion as the officers handcuffed him and read him his Miranda rights. Wilson's demeanor during transport to police headquarters was described by the arresting officers as unnervingly calm, with the suspect asking only practical questions about what would happen to his apartment and his cat while he was in custody. At the station, he was placed in an interview room equipped with recording devices where Detective Davis and his partner would conduct the initial interrogation. Before entering the room, Davis reviewed the case file one final time, particularly the information about the burner phone found with Gabriella, the piece of evidence that had ultimately led them to Wilson. The detective understood that initial interrogations often provided crucial insights into a suspect's psychology and potential defenses, and he was determined to use the phone as a tool to crack Wilson's composed facade. The first hours of the interrogation followed standard procedure, with Wilson providing basic biographical information and maintaining a detached, cooperative demeanor. He confirmed his employment at the college and his residence in Tempe, but denied any knowledge of or involvement with the 3 murdered teenagers. When presented with photographs of the victims, Wilson examined them with clinical detachment, claiming he might have seen them around campus, but had no specific interactions with them. His responses were measured and concise, revealing nothing beyond what was directly asked. Detective Davis noted that Wilson made consistent eye contact, showed no nervous tics or fidgeting, and maintained the same even tone regardless of the question's content, behaviors often associated with practiced deception. The turning point came when Davis placed the evidence bag containing the burner phone found with Gabriella Martinez on the table between them. "We found your fingerprint inside this phone, Henry," Davis said, watching Wilson's face intently for any reaction. This was a strategic exaggeration. The partial print had not been definitively matched to Wilson yet, but it was a common interrogation technique designed to gauge the suspect's response. For the first time, Wilson's composure faltered slightly, his eyes lingering on the bagged phone for several seconds longer than necessary before returning to meet the detective's gaze. "That's not possible," he replied, his voice slightly higher than before. "I've never seen that phone before." Sensing vulnerability, Davis pressed the issue, revealing that they had surveillance footage of Wilson purchasing identical phones at a gas station in Tempe. "We know you made one call from this phone, Henry," he continued. "One call to another prepaid phone that we've traced to your apartment complex. Then you placed it in Gabriella's hand after you killed her. What were you trying to tell us with that phone?" Wilson's right hand formed a fist on the table, his knuckles whitening with pressure, though his face remained impassive. "I want a lawyer," he said after nearly 30 seconds of silence, effectively ending the interrogation. As he was led away to a holding cell, Wilson turned back to Davis and added, "You think you understand what the phone means, but you don't? None of you do." This cryptic statement, captured on the interview room's recording system, would later become a key piece of evidence at trial, interpreted by prosecution experts as an admission of guilt combined with narcissistic pride in what Wilson perceived as his superior intellect. For the investigators, Wilson's request for legal representation was actually a positive development. It indicated their evidence had sufficiently concerned him to abandon his strategy of calm denial. With Wilson in custody and overwhelming physical evidence connecting him to the murders, Detective Davis held a brief press conference announcing the arrest, though he provided few specific details to preserve the integrity of the upcoming prosecution. For the first time in nearly 2 months, the citizens of Phoenix could allow themselves to feel a tentative sense of safety, though the psychological impact of the killings would linger in the community long after Wilson was behind bars. With Henry Wilson in custody, prosecutor Katherine Mitchell assembled a team of the Maricopa County District Attorney's most experienced attorneys to build what she anticipated would be one of the highest-profile murder cases in Arizona's recent history. Mitchell, a veteran prosecutor with 15 years of experience and a reputation for meticulous preparation, understood that despite the substantial physical evidence, securing convictions on 3 counts of first-degree murder would require establishing a clear narrative that connected the burner phone, the foundational clue that had broken the case, to Wilson's motive, means, and opportunity. The prosecution team set up a dedicated conference room at the district attorney's office, walls covered with crime scene photographs, evidence logs, and a detailed timeline of both the murders and the subsequent investigation that had led to Wilson's arrest. Mitchell's first priority was obtaining a comprehensive forensic analysis of all 4 burner phones, the one found with Gabriella and the 3 discovered in Wilson's apartment, to establish an unbreakable chain linking the suspect to the crimes. Digital forensics expert Dr. Jennifer Ramirez conducted an exhaustive examination, recovering deleted data that revealed all 4 phones had been purchased with the same payment card at the same gas station, despite Wilson's careful use of cash for the transactions. The card in question was a prepaid debit card, but the serial number on the activation receipt recovered from Wilson's truck matched the card number in the gas station's payment system. Dr. Ramirez was also able to extract GPS data from the phones, confirming that the device found with Gabriella had been at Wilson's apartment shortly before her estimated time of death, and had traveled along a route consistent with the journey to South Mountain Park, where her body was discovered. The partial fingerprint found inside the battery compartment of the burner phone, recovered from the crime scene, proved to be one of the most contentious pieces of evidence. Defense attorneys immediately challenged its admissibility, arguing that the incomplete nature of the print made identification speculative at best. In response, Mitchell brought in fingerprint expert Dr. Samuel Washington from the FBI's Quantitative Analysis Unit, who utilized advanced algorithmic comparison techniques to establish a 12-point match between the partial print and Wilson's right index finger. Dr. Washington prepared detailed visual aids for the jury, explaining that while traditional fingerprint analysis required 16 matching points for absolute certainty, the 12 points identified, combined with the statistical improbability of another match given the specific pattern of whorls and ridges, created a virtual certainty that the print belonged to Wilson. The burner phone's call record provided another crucial link in the evidentiary chain, showing that it had been used to call another prepaid phone at 9:27 p.m. on the night of Gabriella's disappearance. Cell tower data placed this second phone at Wilson's apartment complex at the time of the call, and a subsequent search of his computer revealed he had researched how police trace prepaid phones just days before purchasing the devices. Mitchell's team constructed a compelling timeline suggesting Wilson had called his own burner phone from Gabriella's phone as a form of signature or trophy, a theory supported by forensic psychologist Dr. Eleanor Patel, who would later testify about the evolution of Wilson's methodology across the 3 murders, with the phone representing his growing confidence and desire for recognition. Beyond the digital evidence, Mitchell focused on strengthening the physical connections between Wilson and the crime scenes. Soil samples from Wilson's truck bed matched the distinct mineral composition found at all three body disposal sites, an unlikely coincidence given the geographical distance between these locations. Fibers recovered from all three victims matched industrial cleaning products exclusively used by the maintenance department at East Valley Community College, and Wilson's work records showed him assigned to areas frequented by each victim in the days before their disappearances. DNA analysis of blood traces found in Wilson's truck matched Gabriella Martinez, while partial DNA profiles recovered from under the fingernails of both Michelle Thompson and Gabriella were consistent with Wilson's DNA, though not conclusive enough for a definitive identification on their own. Perhaps the most damning evidence came from Wilson's own writings. The journal discovered between his mattress and box spring contained not only generalized resentment toward privileged teenagers, but specific references to all three victims, including details about their routines that suggested extended surveillance before the murders. An entry dated the day before Tyler Adams's disappearance read, "T always stays late at the library on Wednesdays, always takes the south exit, always walks alone to the bus stop. No one will miss him for hours. He's perfect." Similar entries existed for Michelle and Gabriella, along with crude maps of their typical routes and notes about security camera blind spots near locations where they were last seen. Mitchell had the journal professionally analyzed by forensic document examiners, who confirmed the handwriting matched exemplars of Wilson's writing from his employment records. The prosecution team also built a psychological profile of Wilson, drawing on his employment history, interviews with former colleagues, and the journal entries to establish a pattern of growing resentment and fixation on successful young people. This profile would become central to establishing motive, as Wilson had no direct connection to any of the victims beyond encountering them at the college where he worked. His performance reviews revealed a man of above-average intelligence who felt severely undervalued, with one supervisor noting Wilson had applied for administrative positions multiple times but was rejected due to his lack of formal education. Mitchell theorized that Wilson had targeted students who represented everything he believed he had been denied: educational opportunities, recognition, and future potential, his rage ultimately manifesting in violence against symbols rather than specific individuals. As the case developed, Mitchell faced a strategic decision regarding the death penalty. Arizona law permitted capital punishment for multiple murders, and the heinous nature of Wilson's crimes potentially qualified him for this ultimate sanction. After consultation with the victims' families and careful consideration of the evidence, Mitchell elected to pursue 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole rather than death, believing this approach would provide more immediate closure for the families and eliminate the decades of appeals typically associated with capital cases. This decision was not universally popular. Some community members demanded the harshest possible punishment, but Mitchell's priority was securing guaranteed incarceration rather than pursuing a more emotionally satisfying but potentially more vulnerable verdict. While the prosecution built their case, Wilson's court-appointed defense team, led by veteran public defender Thomas Reynolds, pursued several strategies to create reasonable doubt about their client's guilt. They challenged the search warrants that had led to the discovery of evidence in Wilson's apartment, arguing that the initial surveillance had been based on profiling rather than substantive evidence. They hired their own experts to dispute the fingerprint analysis, questioning whether 12 points of comparison were truly sufficient for positive identification. Most significantly, they explored the possibility of an alternative suspect, another maintenance worker named Michael Brennan, who had access to the same cleaning products, knowledge of the college campus, and had been interviewed but eliminated early in the investigation. Mitchell anticipated these defense tactics and prepared accordingly, ensuring that every search warrant was procedurally flawless and backed by clearly articulated probable cause. She arranged for investigators to re-interview Michael Brennan and document his alibis for the times of the murders, effectively eliminating him as a viable alternative suspect. She also commissioned an independent fingerprint analysis from a separate laboratory to corroborate the FBI's findings regarding the partial print in the phone. Most importantly, she prepared for challenges to the burner phone evidence by developing multiple independent evidentiary pathways to Wilson's guilt, ensuring that even if some evidence was excluded or discredited, the totality of the case would remain compelling. 4 months after Wilson's arrest, as both legal teams prepared for trial, a final piece of evidence emerged that would prove decisive. A forensic examination of Wilson's personal computer, delayed due to advanced encryption he had employed, finally yielded access to a hidden folder containing photographs of all 3 victims, photographs clearly taken without their knowledge as they moved about campus or traveled to and from school. The timestamps on these surveillance photos aligned perfectly with Wilson's work schedule and the victims' known movements in the days before they disappeared. Even more disturbing were 3 video files showing the actual abductions of Tyler, Michelle, and Gabriella, apparently recorded using a dashboard camera in Wilson's truck. These videos, while not showing the murders themselves, captured Wilson approaching each victim, engaging them in conversation by asking for help with a maintenance issue, and then the subsequent struggle as he forced them into his vehicle. The discovery of these videos transformed the prosecution's case from circumstantial, albeit strong, to virtually irrefutable. Mitchell immediately filed a supplemental evidence disclosure, providing copies to the defense as required by discovery rules, while also requesting enhanced security measures for the upcoming trial. Concerned that the graphic nature of this evidence might trigger extreme reactions from the victims' families or the public, Reynolds filed a last-minute motion to suppress the videos, arguing that the warrant authorizing the computer search had not specifically mentioned video files, but Judge Carlos Mendez quickly denied this motion, ruling that the warrant's language encompassing all digital content was sufficiently broad to include video recordings stored on the computer. As the trial date approached, Mitchell met with the families of all 3 victims to prepare them for the emotional ordeal ahead and explain the strategy she would employ in presenting the evidence. She was particularly concerned about the Martinez family, as the burner phone found with Gabriella would be a central focus of the case, potentially creating additional trauma as they repeatedly confronted this symbol of the killer's twisted psychology. Roberto and Elena Martinez, however, expressed their determination to attend every day of the proceedings, with Roberto telling Mitchell, "We need to see justice happen. For Gabby, we can endure anything." Mitchell was struck by their dignity and resolve, strengthening her own commitment to securing the most comprehensive conviction possible. In the final weeks before trial, Mitchell conducted multiple mock jury presentations, refining the narrative that would connect the disparate pieces of evidence into a coherent and compelling case for Wilson's guilt. She decided to build her opening statement around the burner phone, describing it as both the key that unlocked the case and a window into the defendant's disturbed mind. This phone, placed in the hand of a murdered teenager, was not just evidence, it was a message, she practiced telling the imaginary jury. A message from a man who believed himself too clever to be caught, too special to be governed by the laws that bind the rest of us, too important to be invisible. But that message, meant to demonstrate his superiority, ultimately led us directly to his door. With these preparations complete, and the evidence organized into a devastating chronological presentation, Katherine Mitchell and her team stood ready to bring Henry Wilson to justice for the murders that had terrorized Phoenix and destroyed 3 promising young lives. On the morning of August 12th, 13 days after the discovery of Gabriella Martinez's body, the tactical arrest team assembled at Phoenix Police Headquarters for a final briefing before apprehending Henry Wilson. Detective Marcus Davis reviewed the operation parameters with the 6-officer team, emphasizing that while Wilson had no known history of violence outside the murders, his journal entries revealed a deeply disturbed individual who might react unpredictably when cornered. The plan called for plainclothes officers to position themselves strategically around East Valley Community College's science building, where Wilson's work schedule indicated he would be repairing an air conditioning unit in an unoccupied classroom. Campus security had discreetly cleared the surrounding rooms to minimize risk to students and faculty, creating a controlled environment for the arrest. At precisely 10:15 in the morning, with the summer session classes in full swing elsewhere on campus, Wilson was observed entering room 112 of the Keller Science Building, toolbox in hand, apparently unaware of the net closing around him. 2 officers posing as facilities managers approached him as he began removing the access panel to the classroom's HVAC system, while 2 more officers positioned themselves at the doorway and the remaining team members secured the hallway outside. "Henry Wilson?" asked Detective Lisa Ortiz, holding her badge where he could clearly see it. "I'm Detective Ortiz with Phoenix PD. We need you to step away from your tools and place your hands where we can see them." Wilson's reaction, or rather his lack of reaction, immediately struck the officers as unusual. Without displaying surprise, anger, or fear, he simply set down his screwdriver, straightened up, and placed his hands at shoulder height. "Is this about the phone?" Wilson asked calmly, as Officer James Reyes applied handcuffs, his voice betraying no emotion, despite the gravity of the situation. Detective Ortiz, momentarily taken aback by this apparent reference to the key evidence, exchanged glances with her partner before responding, "You're under arrest for the murders of Tyler Adams, Michelle Thompson, and Gabriella Martinez." As Reyes recited the Miranda warnings, Wilson nodded along as if following a familiar script, his expression remaining impassive, except for a brief moment when Gabriella's name was mentioned. At that single point, witnesses later reported observing what appeared to be a slight smile touching the corners of his mouth. This subtle reaction, captured on the body cameras worn by all officers present, would later be presented at trial as evidence of Wilson's pride in his crimes. The arrest proceeded without physical resistance, with Wilson cooperating fully as officers escorted him through a service corridor to avoid the main campus areas where students might be present. His only requests during transport concerned practical matters. He asked that someone feed his cat, an orange tabby named Schrödinger, and expressed concern about a pot of coffee he had left brewing in his apartment. These mundane concerns, juxtaposed against the horrific nature of his alleged crimes, created an unsettling impression of compartmentalization that forensic psychologists would later identify as characteristic of organized killers who can separate their criminal behavior from their everyday lives. During the 20-minute drive to police headquarters, Wilson sat silently in the back of the unmarked police vehicle, occasionally glancing out the window, but asking no questions about the investigation that had led to his arrest. Upon arrival at headquarters, Wilson was processed according to standard procedure, photographed, fingerprinted, and his personal belongings inventoried and secured. The intake officer noted that Wilson carried minimal items: a wallet containing $87 in cash, a ring of keys, a basic flip phone different from the burner phones associated with the crimes, and a small notebook containing what appeared to be maintenance schedules and parts inventories. Throughout this process, Wilson maintained his composed demeanor, politely complying with all instructions and volunteering no information beyond direct responses to procedural questions. He was then placed in Interview Room 3, a space specifically chosen for its comprehensive recording capabilities, as Detective Davis believed that capturing Wilson's every expression and gesture during questioning could prove crucial to the case. Before entering the interview room, Davis reviewed the evidence summary one final time, paying particular attention to the burner phone found with Gabriella Martinez. This phone represented not only the breakthrough that had led investigators to Wilson, but also potentially offered insight into his psychology and motivation. Davis had interviewed numerous murder suspects during his 16-year career, but he sensed that Wilson would present unique challenges. His apparent calm suggested either practiced deception or a profound emotional disconnection that might make conventional interrogation tactics ineffective. After consulting briefly with the department's psychological consultant, Davis decided on a strategy of initially concealing how much evidence they had accumulated, allowing Wilson to establish his narrative before systematically dismantling it with proof of his deception. The interrogation began at 1:37 in the afternoon, with Detective Davis and his partner, Detective Sandra Ramirez, entering the room where Wilson had been waiting for approximately 40 minutes, a deliberate delay intended to increase anxiety in most suspects, though Wilson showed no signs of impatience or concern. After introducing themselves and confirming Wilson understood his rights, Davis opened with general questions about Wilson's background, employment, and residence. Wilson answered these questions directly and coherently, maintaining steady eye contact and showing none of the nervous behaviors, fidgeting, excessive swallowing, rapid blinking, commonly associated with deception. He confirmed his employment at East Valley Community College for the past 23 months, described his responsibilities as a general maintenance technician, and provided his address in Tempe without hesitation. As the questioning progressed to more specific areas, Wilson's responses remained measured, but began showing subtle signs of calculated evasion. When asked if he was familiar with Tyler Adams, Michelle Thompson, or Gabriella Martinez, he claimed to recognize the names only from news coverage of their murders, adding that he might have seen them around campus, but had no specific interactions with them. Davis noted that Wilson's posture shifted slightly during these denials, his shoulders squared, and his hands, which had been relaxed on the table, pressed flat against the surface as if anchoring himself. These minute changes, nearly imperceptible to an untrained observer, suggested to Davis that Wilson was now actively managing his presentation rather than simply responding truthfully. After establishing Wilson's baseline denials, Davis shifted tactics, presenting photographs of the 3 victims and asking Wilson to look at each one carefully. "Take your time," Davis instructed. "Tell me if you recognize any of these young people from your work at the college." Wilson examined each photograph with clinical detachment, his eyes moving methodically across the features of Tyler, Michelle, and Gabriella, as if studying specimens rather than looking at human beings whose lives had been violently extinguished. After several seconds with each photo, he pushed them back across the table toward Davis, reiterating that he recognized them only from news reports and had no personal knowledge of or interaction with any of them. Detective Ramirez then took the lead, presenting Wilson with a printout of his work assignments for the past 3 months, highlighting the days when he had been scheduled to perform maintenance in the library where Tyler studied, the science building where Michelle attended summer programs, and the student center near the bus stop where Gabriella had been last seen. "That's quite a coincidence, isn't it, Henry?" she asked, her tone conversational rather than accusatory. "You were working in exactly the areas where each victim was last seen, on exactly the days they disappeared." Wilson's response was a textbook deflection. "I work all over campus. The coincidence would be if I hadn't been in those areas at some point." This answer, while logically sound on its surface, represented the first indication that Wilson was actively constructing a defense rather than simply proclaiming innocence. The turning point in the interrogation came approximately 90 minutes into the session, when Detective Davis placed the evidence bag containing the burner phone found with Gabriella Martinez on the table between them. The change in the room's atmosphere was palpable. Wilson's eyes fixed on the phone with an intensity he had not displayed previously, though he made a visible effort to maintain his composed facade. "We found your fingerprint inside this phone, Henry," Davis said, deliberately overstating the conclusiveness of the partial print evidence. "This exact phone was found in Gabriella Martinez's hand after she was murdered. Can you explain how your fingerprint got there?" The 7 seconds of silence that followed this question represented the first crack in Wilson's carefully maintained composure. "That's not possible," Wilson finally replied, his voice pitched slightly higher than it had been throughout the previous questioning. "I've never seen that phone before." The denial itself was expected, but the change in vocal tone and the delay before responding provided Davis with confirmation that the phone represented a vulnerability in Wilson's defenses. Building on this momentum, Davis revealed that surveillance footage from a gas station in Tempe showed Wilson purchasing identical burner phones, including one just days before Gabriella's murder. "We know you made one call from this phone, Henry," he continued, leaning forward slightly. "One call to another prepaid phone that we've traced to your apartment complex. Then you placed it in Gabriella's hand after you killed her. What were you trying to tell us with that phone?" Wilson's physiological response to this direct accusation was subtle but significant. His breathing pattern changed, becoming more deliberate and controlled, while his right hand formed a fist on the table, knuckles whitening with pressure. These stress indicators, combined with the extended silence that followed Davis's question, suggested internal conflict between maintaining his facade and responding to the specific evidence being presented. After nearly 30 seconds of silence, during which both detectives remained quiet, allowing the pressure of the moment to build, Wilson finally spoke the words that would end the substantive portion of the interrogation. "I want a lawyer." This invocation of his right to counsel was not unexpected, and Davis immediately acknowledged the request, informing Wilson that questioning about the crimes would cease until his attorney was present. As the detectives prepared to conclude the session and return Wilson to a holding cell, however, he made a statement that would later feature prominently at his trial. Looking directly at Detective Davis, Wilson said, "You think you understand what the phone means, but you don't. None of you do." This cryptic remark, suggesting both knowledge of the phone's significance and a belief that investigators had misinterpreted its meaning, was recorded in its entirety and would later be interpreted by prosecution experts as a narcissistic need to assert intellectual superiority even at the cost of implicitly acknowledging involvement in the crimes. Following the interrogation, Wilson was transferred to Maricopa County Jail to await arraignment, classified as a high-security inmate due to both the severity of the charges and the high-profile nature of the case that had attracted significant media attention. Detective Davis prepared a detailed report on the interrogation, noting not only Wilson's statements and denials, but also the nonverbal cues and stress responses that had been observed, particularly in relation to the burner phone evidence. This report was immediately forwarded to prosecutor Katherine Mitchell, who recognized that Wilson's reaction to the phone, combined with his cryptic parting statement, provided valuable insight into potential trial strategies. While Wilson consulted with his court-appointed attorney, investigators continued processing evidence from his apartment and vehicle, strengthening the case beyond the initial burner phone connection. The search of his computer yielded the surveillance photographs and abduction videos that would ultimately become the most damning evidence against him. His journal, with its detailed entries about the victims and explicit descriptions of planning the murders, provided a window into his disturbed psychology and established clear premeditation. The physical evidence, the matching cord, the victim's belongings, the soil samples from his truck bed matching the disposal sites, created a comprehensive web connecting Wilson to all three crimes beyond reasonable doubt. 6 days after his arrest, Wilson appeared for arraignment before Judge Carlos Mendez, represented by Public Defender Thomas Reynolds. The courtroom was filled to capacity, with family members of all three victims seated in the front row directly in Wilson's line of sight as he entered wearing the standard orange jumpsuit of the Maricopa County Detention System. For the first time since his arrest, Wilson's composed facade showed signs of strain. His eyes darted around the crowded courtroom, and he licked his lips repeatedly, a stress response he had not exhibited during the initial interrogation. When the charges were read, 3 counts of first-degree murder, 3 counts of kidnapping, and 1 count of predatory criminal conduct, Wilson's voice was barely audible as he stated "not guilty" to each charge. Following the arraignment, Prosecutor Mitchell held a brief press conference on the courthouse steps, where she formally announced that the state would seek 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole rather than the death penalty. She explained this decision as a means of providing more immediate closure for the victims' families while ensuring Wilson would never again pose a threat to the community. When a reporter asked about the burner phone that had reportedly broken the case, Mitchell offered a measured response that would set the tone for the prosecution's approach throughout the proceedings. That phone represents both Mr. Wilson's fatal miscalculation and the meticulous investigative work that brought him to justice. He believed it was a message of superiority. Instead, it became the first link in the chain of evidence that will keep him behind bars for the rest of his life. As Wilson was led back to his cell after the arraignment, he passed within several feet of Roberto and Elena Martinez, Gabriella's parents, who had attended the proceeding, along with relatives of the other victims. Elena, who had maintained remarkable composure throughout the hearing, suddenly called out in Spanish, "¿Por qué nuestra hija? ¿Por qué Gabriela?" "Why our daughter? Why Gabriella?" Witnesses reported that Wilson paused briefly upon hearing her voice, turning slightly toward the grieving mother before guards urged him forward. In that moment of unexpected confrontation, his expression betrayed a flicker of something that courthouse observers variously described as confusion, contempt, or, most disturbingly, satisfaction. This unguarded reaction, like his statement about the phone at the conclusion of his interrogation, suggested that beneath Wilson's carefully maintained facade lay a profound psychological disturbance that would become increasingly apparent as the case progressed toward trial. The state of Arizona versus Henry Wilson commenced on a crisp February morning, 6 months after the arrest that had brought a tentative sense of closure to the community, still reeling from the summer's violence. The Maricopa County Superior Courthouse in downtown Phoenix, a modern 6-story structure of glass and sandstone, had been prepared for what court officials anticipated would be one of the most closely watched trials in the state's recent history. Enhanced security measures were implemented, including additional screening checkpoints, an increased sheriff's department presence, and a dedicated media area to accommodate the dozens of reporters covering the proceedings. Judge Carlos Mendez, a 28-year veteran of the bench, known for his strict courtroom management and meticulous attention to procedural detail, had been assigned to preside over the case. Inside Courtroom 4, the atmosphere was solemn and tense as prospective jurors filed in for the selection process, many visibly uncomfortable with the prospect of serving on a case involving such horrific crimes against young victims. The voir dire process was painstaking, with prosecutor Katherine Mitchell and defense attorney Thomas Reynolds carefully probing each candidate's potential biases, exposure to pretrial publicity, and ability to render an impartial verdict based solely on evidence presented in court rather than media narratives. Judge Mendez dismissed numerous candidates who acknowledged they had already formed opinions about Wilson's guilt, ultimately requiring 3 days to seat 12 jurors and 4 alternates who satisfied both the prosecution and defense as being capable of fairness, despite the emotional nature of the case. The final jury composition reflected the diverse community of Maricopa County, 7 women and 5 men ranging in age from 26 to 71, including a retired school principal, a nurse, a software developer, a postal worker, a construction manager, and a graduate student, among others. 3 jurors were Hispanic, 2 were black, 1 was Asian American, and 6 were white. Judge Mendez instructed them about their responsibilities in detail, emphasizing that they must presume the defendant innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, consider only evidence presented in court, and refrain from any external research or discussion about the case. Each juror solemnly affirmed their commitment to these principles, though several appeared visibly affected when Mendez warned them that the evidence would include disturbing crime scene photographs and videos. Henry Wilson was brought into the courtroom each day through a secure entrance, wearing a charcoal gray suit provided by his defense team rather than jail attire, a standard practice intended to prevent jury bias that might result from seeing the defendant in prison clothing. The transformation was striking, with his sandy brown hair neatly trimmed, wire-rimmed glasses in place of the contact lenses he typically wore, and appropriate business attire. Wilson presented as a surprisingly ordinary young man who might have been a graduate student or junior professor at the very college where he had worked in maintenance. This visual impression of normalcy created a jarring contrast with the horrific acts described in the charges against him, a dissonance that Reynolds clearly hoped would plant seeds of doubt in jurors' minds about Wilson's capacity for the calculated violence alleged by the prosecution. When Katherine Mitchell rose to deliver her opening statement, the courtroom fell into complete silence, with family members of the victims leaning forward in their seats in the front row directly behind the prosecution table. Mitchell, wearing a conservative navy suit and minimal jewelry, approached the jury with a measured confidence born of months of preparation and years of courtroom experience. Rather than beginning with the gruesome details of the murders, she opened with a simple object lesson, holding up a replica of the burner phone found with Gabriella Martinez. She turned it slowly for all jurors to see. This ordinary phone, purchased for less than $20 at a gas station convenience store, is where this case begins and ends, she told them. It was the defendant's signature, his message to investigators, and ultimately the first thread that, when pulled, unraveled his entire carefully constructed plan. Mitchell's opening narrative wove together the 3 murders, establishing their connections while humanizing the victims. Tyler Adams, the baseball player with a gift for mathematics. Michelle Thompson, the cellist who taught music to underprivileged children, and Gabriella Martinez, the aspiring doctor whose acceptance to a prestigious internship program was found in her backpack at the crime scene. She described how each teenager had been selected, stalked, and ultimately abducted by the defendant, who used his position as a maintenance worker at East Valley Community College to move invisibly through the spaces they frequented. The evidence will show that Henry Wilson selected these young people precisely because of their promise, their potential, and their achievements, Mitchell explained. He targeted them because they represented everything he believed he had been denied. The prosecutor methodically outlined the evidence the state would present, beginning with the burner phone that had led investigators to Wilson. She explained how digital forensics had recovered GPS data from the phone, showing it had been at Wilson's apartment before being found with Gabriella, how cell tower records placed his personal phone near all 3 body disposal locations at the relevant times, and how surveillance footage captured him purchasing identical burner phones at a Tempe gas station. Mitchell then described the physical evidence recovered from Wilson's apartment and vehicle, the nylon cord matching the ligature marks on all victims, the personal belongings taken from each teenager, the soil samples in his truck bed matching the disposal sites, and most damning, the journal containing detailed surveillance notes about each victim prior to their disappearances. But the evidence doesn't stop there, Mitchell continued, her voice growing more somber. The defendant documented his crimes, recording videos of the abductions that were recovered from a hidden folder on his computer. You will see Henry Wilson approach each victim, engage them in conversation by asking for help with a maintenance issue, and then force them into his vehicle. At this statement, audible gasps came from the gallery, and Elena Martinez buried her face against her husband's shoulder, unable to bear the thought of witnessing her daughter's final moments of freedom. Judge Mendez briefly reminded spectators to maintain decorum, his own expression reflecting the gravity of what had just been revealed to the court. Mitchell concluded by directly addressing the burner phone again, framing it as the key to understanding not just how Wilson was caught, but why he had committed these crimes in the first place. This phone, deliberately placed in Gabriella Martinez's hand after her murder, was not just evidence. It was a message, she told the jury. A message from a man who believed himself too clever to be caught, too special to be bound by the laws and morals that govern our society, too important to remain invisible. The evidence will show that Henry Wilson killed these three young people not in a moment of passion or impulse, but through careful planning driven by resentment, entitlement, and a disturbing belief that their deaths would somehow elevate his own significance. The phone was his signature, his way of taking credit for what he considered his masterpiece. With these words, Mitchell returned to her seat, leaving the jury with a compelling framework for understanding the evidence they would soon encounter. When Thomas Reynolds rose for the defense's opening statement, he faced the considerable challenge of addressing a case where physical evidence appeared overwhelming. A public defender with 22 years of experience, Reynolds had built his reputation on thorough preparation and an unflinching commitment to ensuring that even defendants accused of the most heinous crimes received constitutionally guaranteed representation. His approach acknowledged the emotional impact of the crimes while urging jurors to set aside preconceptions and evaluate the evidence critically. The deaths of Tyler Adams, Michelle Thompson, and Gabriella Martinez were tragic, senseless, and devastating to their families and our community, he began. Nothing I say here is meant to minimize that tragedy or the pain it has caused, but my role and your duty as jurors is to ensure that in our pursuit of justice, we do not sacrifice the principles of due process that protect all citizens. Reynolds focused on creating reasonable doubt about the state's narrative, suggesting alternative interpretations of key evidence and highlighting potential weaknesses in the investigation. He questioned whether the partial fingerprint found on the burner phone provided sufficient points of comparison for a definitive identification, noted that the industrial cleaning products linked to fibers found on the victims were used by multiple maintenance staff at the college, and suggested that Wilson's presence near the crime scenes could be explained by his normal work and travel patterns in a city where he both lived and worked. Most importantly, Reynolds introduced the possibility that evidence from Wilson's apartment and computer had been misinterpreted or even manipulated, promising to present expert testimony challenging the digital forensics methodology used to recover the surveillance photos and videos. The prosecution's case relies heavily on technology, cell phone tracking, digital forensics, partial fingerprints enhanced by computer algorithms, Reynolds told the jury. But technology is only as reliable as the humans who operate it and interpret its results. Throughout this trial, we will demonstrate that alternative explanations exist for much of what the state presents as definitive proof of Mr. Wilson's guilt. He concluded by reminding jurors of the presumption of innocence and the state's burden to prove its case beyond reasonable doubt. urging them to approach the evidence with open but critical minds rather than allowing the emotional nature of the crimes to override their analytical judgment. The prosecution's case began with testimony from first responders and crime scene investigators establishing the basic facts of each murder through photographs, diagrams, and detailed descriptions of how the bodies were discovered. Detective Marcus Davis took the stand for 2 full days, walking jurors through the investigation from the discovery of Tyler Adams' body through the collection of evidence at each scene, the identification of patterns linking the murders, and ultimately the discovery of the burner phone with Gabriella Martinez that had broken the case open. Davis proved to be an effective witness, balancing technical precision with accessible language that helped jurors understand the methodical process that had led investigators to Henry Wilson. During cross-examination, Reynolds attempted to highlight potential investigative shortcuts, suggesting that once Wilson became the primary suspect, detectives had focused exclusively on evidence supporting his guilt while ignoring alternative possibilities. Davis remained unflappable, acknowledging that Wilson became the focus after multiple evidence sources pointed to him, but maintaining that investigators had thoroughly explored and eliminated other potential suspects, including Michael Brennan, another maintenance worker with similar access and knowledge of the campus. When Reynolds pressed Davis on whether confirmation bias might have influenced the investigation, the detective responded with a line that resonated with jurors. Confirmation bias looks for evidence to support a theory. We followed evidence that led to a suspect, not the other way around. The testimony of digital forensics expert Dr. Jennifer Ramirez provided the technical foundation for the prosecution's case, explaining how data recovered from the burner phones established their connection to Wilson. Using clear visual aids and accessible analogies, Dr. Ramirez explained how GPS data stored in the phone found with Gabriella placed it at Wilson's apartment before traveling along a route consistent with the journey to South Mountain Park, where her body was discovered. She detailed how all 4 burner phones, the one found with Gabriella, and the 3 discovered in Wilson's apartment, had been purchased with the same payment card at the same gas station, creating an unbreakable chain linking Wilson to the key evidence. Reynolds's cross-examination of Dr. Ramirez focused on technical limitations, questioning the precision of GPS data from basic phones and suggesting that digital information could potentially be manipulated. Dr. Ramirez acknowledged that GPS coordinates from burner phones were less precise than smartphone data, but maintained that the pattern of movement was consistent with Wilson's travel from his apartment to the body disposal site. When Reynolds suggested that someone with technical knowledge could have planted or altered digital evidence on Wilson's computer, Dr. Ramirez explained the chain of custody protocols and verification methods used to ensure data integrity, effectively neutralizing this line of attack. The most powerful testimony came from FBI fingerprint expert Dr. Samuel Washington, who explained the 12-point match between Wilson's right index finger and the partial print found inside the burner phone's battery compartment. Using enlarged visualizations projected on screens visible to the jury and gallery, Dr. Washington pointed out the specific whorls, ridges, and minutiae that created unique patterns matching Wilson's print. He acknowledged that traditional standards often required 16 matching points for courtroom identification, but explained that modern algorithmic analysis allowed for greater certainty with fewer points, especially when considering the statistical improbability of another match given the specific pattern observed. During cross-examination, Reynolds challenged Dr. Washington's methodology, introducing his own expert who questioned whether 12 points were sufficient for a positive identification and suggesting that the partial nature of the print made comparison inherently less reliable. Dr. Washington responded by walking through each matching point in detail, explaining that the quality of the points identified, rather than simply their quantity, provided scientific certainty of the match. He also noted that the location of the print inside the battery compartment rather than on the phone's exterior was consistent with someone opening the device to check or remove the battery and then wiping down the exterior surfaces, a pattern of behavior suggesting consciousness of evidentiary concerns. As the first week of trial concluded, Prosecutor Mitchell had established a compelling narrative connecting Wilson to the murders through the burner phone evidence, supported by expert testimony explaining the technical and forensic aspects in terms accessible to the jury. The victims' families had maintained a dignified presence throughout, their grief visible but contained as they listened to clinical descriptions of crime scenes where their children had been found. Wilson himself remained largely expressionless during the proceedings, occasionally making notes on a legal pad or conferring quietly with Reynolds, but showing no discernible reaction to the evidence being presented against him. This emotional detachment did not go unnoticed by the jury, several of whom were observed watching Wilson's face during particularly damning testimony, seemingly searching for any sign of remorse or human connection to the crimes he was alleged to have committed. The second week of trial began with what would prove to be the prosecution's most compelling witness, Dr. Jennifer Ramirez, returning to the stand to present her comprehensive digital forensic analysis linking all technological evidence to Henry Wilson. The courtroom was filled to capacity, with additional spectators queuing outside in hopes of gaining admission if space became available. Judge Mendez had authorized the use of a larger-than-standard evidence screen to ensure that complex digital exhibits would be clearly visible to all jurors, and Prosecutor Mitchell had prepared a series of simplified visual aids to help translate technical concepts into accessible information. Wilson, seated beside Thomas Reynolds at the defense table, appeared more tense than during previous proceedings, his normally impassive expression occasionally betraying flickers of concern as Dr. Ramirez was sworn in. Mitchell began by establishing Dr. Ramirez's credentials: a Ph.D. in computer science from Stanford University, 15 years of experience in digital forensics with both the FBI and private consulting firms, and certification in multiple forensic analysis methodologies. She had previously testified in 78 criminal trials and was widely published in peer-reviewed journals on topics including data recovery techniques, cell phone tracking algorithms, and digital evidence authentication. This extensive background established not only her technical expertise, but also her familiarity with courtroom proceedings and the standards for explaining complex technological evidence to non-specialist jurors. Reynolds stipulated to Dr. Ramirez's qualifications rather than challenging them, a tactical decision that avoided drawing additional attention to her impressive credentials. Dr. Ramirez, you've previously testified about the burner phone found with Gabriella Martinez and its connection to the defendant, Mitchell began. Today, I'd like you to explain to the jury how this phone fits into a broader digital ecosystem that links Mr. Wilson to all three victims. With this framing, Mitchell guided Dr. Ramirez through a methodical presentation that transformed isolated pieces of digital evidence into an interconnected web, each element reinforcing the others and collectively pointing to Wilson's guilt. The expert's testimony would become the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, providing scientific validation for the narrative Mitchell had outlined in her opening statement. Dr. Ramirez began by displaying a timeline visualization showing the activity of 4 distinct phones: Wilson's personal cell phone, the burner phone found with Gabriella, and the 2 other burner phones recovered from his apartment. Using color-coded mapping overlaid with cell tower data, she demonstrated how Wilson's personal phone could be placed near the locations where each victim was last seen, near the locations where each body was discovered, and in the vicinity of the gas station where surveillance footage showed him purchasing the burner phones. What we're seeing here is a pattern of movement that cannot be coincidental, she explained. The probability of someone else having this exact same pattern of phone movements in these specific locations at these specific times is astronomically low. The most damning portion of Dr. Ramirez's testimony came when she presented her analysis of the data extracted from Wilson's computer. Despite sophisticated encryption and evidence of attempted file deletion, her team had recovered numerous photographs of all three victims taken without their knowledge. Tyler Adams leaving baseball practice, Michelle Thompson waiting at a bus stop, Gabriella Martinez volunteering at the animal shelter. The timestamps on these surveillance photos aligned perfectly with Wilson's work schedule and the victims' known movements in the days before they disappeared. These were not random photographs, Dr. Ramirez testified. They represent systematic surveillance, capturing routines and vulnerabilities that would later be exploited in the abductions. Mitchell then asked about the video files recovered from Wilson's computer, a question that caused visible tension in the courtroom. Judge Mendez had previously ruled that these videos could be shown to the jury despite their disturbing nature, determining that their probative value outweighed concerns about their emotional impact. Before they were played, however, he instructed family members who wished to leave the courtroom to do so, and several relatives of the victims chose to step outside. Dr. Ramirez explained that the videos had been recorded using a dashboard camera in Wilson's truck and had been stored in a hidden folder with triple-layer encryption, suggesting extraordinary efforts to conceal their existence. The videos, played sequentially with Dr. Ramirez providing technical commentary, showed Wilson approaching each victim, engaging them in conversation by asking for help with a maintenance issue, and then the subsequent struggle as he forced them into his vehicle. Although the footage did not show the murders themselves, the abductions were captured in clear detail. Tyler Adams being approached in a campus parking lot, Michelle Thompson asked for directions near a bus stop, and most disturbingly, Gabriella Martinez being offered a ride by Wilson, who was wearing his maintenance department uniform, creating an initial sense of trust that he exploited. The jury watched in complete silence, several members visibly struggling with the content as the final moments of these young people's freedom unfolded before them. Dr. Ramirez, can you explain how you verified the authenticity of these videos? Mitchell asked after the footage concluded, addressing potential defense challenges before Reynolds could raise them. Dr. Ramirez detailed the multiple validation methods employed, including metadata analysis, timestamp verification against known events, and distinctive visual markers from Wilson's vehicle that appeared consistently across all three recordings. She explained that the encryption methods used to hide the files were sophisticated and uncommon, requiring specialized knowledge that matched Wilson's background in computer repair, which he had mentioned in his employment application, but had not been part of his maintenance duties. Perhaps most significant was Dr. Ramirez's testimony about the burner phone found with Gabriella and how it connected to the broader pattern of evidence. She explained that while burner phones were often chosen for their anonymity, this particular phone had yielded multiple digital connections to Wilson. The GPS data showing its presence at his apartment, the cell tower data placing it on a path to the body disposal site, and the single call made to another burner phone consistently located near Wilson's residence all created a digital signature as unique and identifiable as the fingerprint found inside its battery compartment. In digital forensics, we look for convergence, multiple independent data points that lead to the same conclusion, she explained. In this case, every digital thread leads directly to the defendant. During cross-examination, Reynolds attempted to undermine Dr. Ramirez's testimony by suggesting alternative interpretations of the digital evidence. He questioned whether GPS data from basic burner phones was precise enough for definitive location matching, whether cell tower pings could reliably place Wilson at exact crime scene locations rather than general areas, and whether the recovered videos could have been manipulated or fabricated by someone with sufficient technical skill. Dr. Ramirez acknowledged the limitations of individual pieces of evidence, but emphasized that the constellation of digital data, when viewed collectively, created a pattern that could not be explained by coincidence or manipulation. Dr. Ramirez, isn't it true that cell phone tower data can only place a phone within a radius of up to 2 miles, not at a specific address? Reynolds asked. The expert conceded this point, but immediately contextualized it. That's correct in isolation, but when you have multiple towers triangulating a signal over time, combined with GPS data and corresponding surveillance footage showing the defendant in those same areas, the precision increases exponentially. This pattern of response, acknowledging technical limitations while reinforcing the cumulative weight of evidence, effectively neutralized Reynolds' attempts to create reasonable doubt through technical minutiae. Following Dr. Ramirez's testimony, Mitchell called FBI fingerprint expert Dr. Samuel Washington back to the stand to provide additional context for the partial fingerprint found inside the burner phone's battery compartment. Building on his previous testimony, Dr. Washington used advanced visualization technology to demonstrate the 12 matching points between Wilson's right index fingerprint and the partial print recovered from the phone. He explained that the location of the print inside the battery compartment was particularly significant, as it suggested someone had opened the phone, likely to remove the battery or SIM card after use, while being careful to wipe down external surfaces that might more obviously retain fingerprints. This print tells us a story, Dr. Washington testified. It tells us that someone who understood how evidence works opened this phone, probably to disable or remove components that could be tracked, and was meticulous about removing prints from obvious surfaces, but overlooked the interior compartment. That's consistent with a perpetrator who is knowledgeable but not infallible. This characterization aligned with the prosecution's portrayal of Wilson as intelligent and calculating, but ultimately overconfident in his ability to outsmart investigators, a narrative that the burner phone evidence powerfully reinforced. The defense's cross-examination of Dr. Washington focused on challenging the reliability of the 12-point match, introducing research suggesting that partial prints could lead to misidentifications. Reynolds presented academic articles questioning whether fewer than 16 matching points could provide sufficient certainty for criminal proceedings, attempting to create doubt about what appeared to be definitive evidence. Dr. Washington responded by explaining that modern fingerprint analysis combined traditional point matching with algorithmic assessment of probability, significantly reducing the likelihood of false positives. When Reynolds pressed him on whether he could be absolutely certain of the match, Dr. Washington's response was measured but effective. In forensic science, we don't deal in absolute certainty, but in the statistical improbability of alternatives. In this case, the probability that this print belongs to anyone other than the defendant is less than 1 in several million. The prosecution's case gained additional strength from the testimony of forensic psychologist Dr. Eleanor Patel, who analyzed Wilson's journal entries and digital communications to provide insight into his motivations and psychological state. Dr. Patel explained that the journal revealed a pattern of escalating resentment toward privileged teenagers and academic elites, with increasingly specific references to students at East Valley Community College whom Wilson encountered during his maintenance work. She characterized his psychology as combining elements of narcissism, profound insecurity, and a desire for recognition and control that he could not achieve through conventional means. The journal entries and surveillance photos show a progression from generalized resentment to specific targeting, Dr. Patel testified. The defendant selected victims who represented what he believed he had been denied: educational opportunities, recognition, and future potential. The burner phone placed with Gabriella Martinez represents what we call a signature, a non-necessary element added to the crime that serves the perpetrator's psychological needs. She explained that the phone symbolized both communication and its absence, Wilson's desire to be acknowledged, while simultaneously ensuring his victims were permanently silenced, a pattern consistent with perpetrators who commit violence as a means of asserting significance in a world where they feel invisible. During cross-examination, Reynolds attempted to discredit Dr. Patel's analysis by suggesting it was speculative rather than scientific, questioning whether psychological interpretations of journal entries could be considered reliable evidence rather than subjective opinion. Dr. Patel defended her methodology by referencing established research on offender profiling and signature analysis, explaining that certain behavioral patterns were well documented in cases involving similarly motivated killers. When Reynolds suggested that her interpretation of the burner phone as a signature was merely conjecture, Dr. Patel referenced Wilson's own statement to Detective Davis after his arrest. "You think you understand what the phone means, but you don't," as evidence that the phone held specific psychological significance to the perpetrator. The prosecution's final expert witness was trace evidence analyst Dr. Marcus Chen, who provided scientific confirmation of physical connections between Wilson and all three crime scenes. Dr. Chen testified that soil samples from Wilson's truck bed matched the distinct mineral composition of all three body disposal sites, an unlikely coincidence given the geographical distance between these locations and their specific geological characteristics. Fibers recovered from all three victims matched industrial cleaning products exclusively used by the maintenance department at East Valley Community College, and comparison of these fibers with samples taken from Wilson's work clothing showed identical wear patterns and chemical residue, suggesting direct transfer during physical contact. Most damning was Dr. Chen's analysis of the nylon cord found in Wilson's apartment, which he determined was microscopically identical to the ligature marks on all three victims. The specific weave pattern, diameter, and composition of this cord creates a distinctive signature when used as a ligature, he explained, showing side-by-side comparisons of cord samples and wound patterns from the autopsy reports. The statistical probability of another cord creating identical marks is extremely low, comparable to the uniqueness of a fingerprint. This evidence directly connected Wilson to the physical act of strangulation, providing tangible proof beyond the digital and circumstantial connections previously established. As the prosecution's case neared its conclusion, Mitchell called one final witness, Ravinder Patel, the gas station clerk who had first noticed Wilson purchasing multiple burner phones. Patel's testimony was brief but powerful, as he identified Wilson in court as the customer he remembered because of his unusual purchasing pattern and apparent nervousness. He always came very early in the morning, always paid cash, always declined a receipt, and never made eye contact, Patel recalled. After seeing the news about the murders, I remembered him and checked our security footage. This testimony provided human confirmation of the surveillance footage that had initially led investigators to Wilson, creating a complete circle of evidence beginning and ending with the burner phones that had become the central focus of the case. With Patel's testimony complete, Prosecutor Mitchell announced that the state rested its case, having presented a comprehensive narrative supported by forensic evidence, expert analysis, and eyewitness testimony. The digital breadcrumbs left by the burner phone found with Gabriella Martinez had led to overwhelming proof of Wilson's guilt, transforming what the defendant had apparently intended as a signature of superiority into the instrument of his downfall. As Judge Mendez adjourned court for the day, the gallery buzzed with subdued conversation, many observers commenting that the defense faced a seemingly insurmountable task encountering the mountain of evidence Mitchell had methodically assembled, all stemming from the single burner phone that Wilson had deliberately left behind. After 12 days of testimony, 97 exhibits, and 24 witnesses, the fate of Henry Wilson rested in the hands of 12 citizens of Maricopa County, sequestered in a conference room on the 5th floor of the courthouse to begin their deliberations. Judge Carlos Mendez had delivered comprehensive instructions outlining the legal standards for each charge: 3 counts of first-degree murder, 3 counts of kidnapping, and 1 count of predatory criminal conduct, emphasizing that the prosecution bore the burden of proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt on each individual count. The jurors were provided with copies of these instructions, verdict forms for each charge, and access to the evidence that had been admitted during trial. Their deliberations would determine not only Wilson's future, but also whether the families of Tyler Adams, Michelle Thompson, and Gabriella Martinez would receive the legal closure they had awaited for nearly 8 months. The courtroom had been packed for closing arguments, with overflow seating arranged in an adjacent room where proceedings were broadcast on closed-circuit television. Prosecutor Katherine Mitchell had delivered a methodical summation that integrated all elements of the state's case into a coherent narrative of premeditation, execution, and attempted concealment, ultimately undone by the defendant's own psychological need for recognition. She had returned repeatedly to the burner phone found with Gabriella, characterizing it as both the signature of a killer who believed himself untouchable and the first domino in a chain of evidence that would ensure justice. Using visual aids that connected each piece of evidence to the others, Mitchell had created a comprehensive web with Wilson at its center, arguing that the totality of evidence eliminated any reasonable doubt about his guilt. Defense attorney Thomas Reynolds had faced the daunting task of addressing this mountain of evidence in his closing argument, focusing on potential weaknesses in individual elements rather than attempting to counter the entire narrative. He had questioned the reliability of partial fingerprint identification, suggested alternative interpretations of the digital evidence, and emphasized that much of the physical evidence was circumstantial rather than directly proving Wilson's commission of the murders. His most effective argument had centered on the psychological testimony, suggesting that extrapolations about Wilson's motives and mental state were speculative rather than factual, and urging jurors to distinguish between proven actions and interpretive analysis. Throughout, Reynolds had maintained a respectful tone toward the victims and their families, while fulfilling his constitutional obligation to provide Wilson with a vigorous defense. As deliberations began, legal analysts commenting on the case for local and national media generally predicted a quick verdict, citing the overwhelming forensic evidence and Wilson's lack of alibi for the critical time frames surrounding each murder. However, Judge Mendez had instructed the jury to consider each charge separately and methodically, a process that would necessarily require careful review of the evidence related to each victim. The jurors had been provided with a secure room containing the physical evidence they had requested to examine, including photographs of the burner phone found with Gabriella, the journal recovered from Wilson's apartment, and the maps showing the locations of abductions and body discoveries overlaid with cell phone tracking data. Inside the deliberation room, the 12 jurors initially voted to appoint Margaret Winters, a 63-year-old retired school principal, as foreperson, recognizing her organizational skills and ability to facilitate discussion without dominating it. Winters suggested they begin by reviewing the legal standards for each charge and establishing a structured approach to evaluating the evidence, a methodology that reflected her educational background and was readily accepted by the other jurors. They agreed to consider each victim's case individually before addressing the overarching charge of predatory criminal conduct, which required finding a pattern of behavior across multiple criminal acts. This methodical approach would ensure that their verdict, whatever it might be, would withstand legal scrutiny and provide clear answers to the charges presented. While the jury deliberated, Wilson remained in a holding cell adjacent to the courtroom, spending most of his time reading a paperback novel and occasionally conferring with Reynolds about potential outcomes and appeal strategies should the verdict go against him. His effect continued to be strikingly flat given the gravity of his situation, with courthouse deputies reporting that he appeared more concerned about the completion date for a science fiction series he was reading than about the jury's ongoing deliberations. This emotional detachment had been evident throughout the trial, with Wilson rarely reacting visibly to even the most damning testimony, a demeanor that some jurors had privately found unsettling, and prosecutors had suggested reflected his fundamental disconnect from the humanity of his victims. The families of Tyler Adams, Michelle Thompson, and Gabriella Martinez gathered in a private conference room provided by the district attorney's office, supported by victim advocates, and occasionally visited by Katherine Mitchell, who provided updates on the jury's requests for evidence and procedural questions without speculating on the direction of their deliberations. Roberto and Elena Martinez held hands almost continuously, drawing strength from each other as they had throughout the ordeal of their daughter's murder and the subsequent investigation and trial. Tyler's parents, James and Susan Adams, had brought a small framed photograph of their son in his baseball uniform, placing it on the conference table as a reminder of why they endured the painful process of seeking justice. Michelle's mother, Patricia Thompson, a single parent who had worked 2 jobs to support her daughter's musical education, wore her daughter's silver bracelet, the match to the one found in Wilson's apartment, as a tangible connection to the child she had lost. After 6 hours and 23 minutes of deliberation, a duration that surprised many observers who had expected either a much quicker decision given the evidence or a much longer process given the multiple charges, the jury sent word to Judge Mendez that they had reached unanimous verdicts on all counts. The courtroom filled quickly as the news spread, with journalists rushing to secure seats and family members of the victims returning to the front row, where they had maintained their dignified presence throughout the proceedings. Wilson was brought in from the holding cell, his expression unchanged from earlier in the day, while Reynolds whispered final instructions about maintaining composure regardless of the outcome. Katherine Mitchell and her co-counsel arranged their notes at the prosecution table, their professional demeanor masking the enormous emotional investment they had made in bringing the case to this moment. Judge Mendez called the court to order with 3 sharp raps of his gavel. His normally stern expression softened slightly in acknowledgment of the emotional significance of the moment for all involved. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I understand you have reached verdicts on all counts," he stated. "Is that correct?" Margaret Winters rose as foreperson, her voice steady as she confirmed they had. The clerk collected the verdict forms from Winters and delivered them to Judge Mendez, who reviewed them silently before returning them to be read aloud. The tension in the courtroom was palpable, the only sounds the occasional creak of wooden benches and the soft weeping of Elena Martinez, who clutched a rosary in her trembling hands. On count 1, first-degree murder in the death of Tyler Adams, we, the jury, find the defendant, Henry Wilson, guilty. The word landed with physical force in the silent courtroom, followed by a collective exhale from the victims' families. The clerk continued reading each verdict in turn. On count 2, first-degree murder in the death of Michelle Thompson, we, the jury, find the defendant, Henry Wilson, guilty. On count 3, first-degree murder in the death of Gabriella Martinez, we, the jury, find the defendant, Henry Wilson, guilty. Each pronouncement was met with the same restrained reaction from the gallery. No outbursts or celebrations, only the quiet release of long-held breath and the occasional sob, quickly muffled. The additional charges followed the same pattern: guilty verdicts on all 3 kidnapping counts and on the predatory criminal conduct charge, completing a clean sweep for the prosecution. Wilson's reaction to the verdicts was minimal but noticeable to those watching closely: a slight tightening of his jaw, a momentary closing of his eyes as the final guilty was read, and most disturbingly to many observers, what appeared to be a faint smile that briefly touched his lips before disappearing. This fleeting expression was captured by courtroom cameras and would become the subject of much discussion in subsequent media coverage, with forensic psychologists suggesting it represented Wilson's continued detachment from reality, and perhaps even pride in having achieved the notoriety he had sought through his crimes. Judge Mendez polled each juror individually, confirming that each verdict represented their true and independent judgment, before thanking them for their service and scheduling the sentencing hearing for 2 weeks later. As the jurors filed out, several glanced at the victims' families, their faces reflecting the emotional weight of the responsibility they had carried. One juror, a mother of teenage children, briefly made eye contact with Gabriella Martinez, the silent exchange communicating a depth of empathy that transcended words. Another juror, an older man who had remained stoically attentive throughout the trial, wiped away tears as he passed the prosecution table, nodding slightly to Katherine Mitchell in acknowledgment of the justice they had collectively delivered. Outside the courthouse, in the bright Arizona sunshine that contrasted sharply with the somber proceedings within, Katherine Mitchell addressed the assembled media, flanked by the families of all 3 victims. "Today, justice has been served for Tyler, Michelle, and Gabriella," she stated, her professional demeanor momentarily softened by evident emotion. "These verdicts cannot restore the lives that were taken or heal the wounds inflicted on 3 families, but they ensure that Henry Wilson will never again have the opportunity to act on his disturbed compulsions." She acknowledged the extraordinary investigative work that had begun with the discovery of a single burner phone and culminated in the comprehensive case presented to the jury, thanking Detective Marcus Davis and his team for their tireless efforts in following every lead and building an airtight case. Roberto Martinez stepped forward to speak on behalf of the families, his English carefully measured as he expressed gratitude to the prosecutors, investigators, and jurors. "Today we have answer, but not peace," he said, his voice steady despite the evident grief in his eyes. "Our children remain gone from us. The hole in our hearts remains, but we know now that the man who took them has been held accountable, and no other family will suffer this pain because of him." Patricia Thompson stood beside him, nodding in agreement, while James and Susan Adams held a framed photograph of their son, silently bearing witness to the justice that had been secured for him and the other young victims. The dignity and restraint of these grieving parents, standing together despite their different backgrounds and circumstances, created a powerful image of unified purpose that dominated news coverage of the verdict. In the days following the guilty verdicts, Phoenix began the complex process of processing and healing from the trauma that had affected the entire community. East Valley Community College announced the establishment of the Adams Thompson Martinez Memorial Scholarship Fund, which would annually provide financial support to students pursuing the dreams that Tyler, Michelle, and Gabriella had been prevented from achieving. The City Council approved funding for enhanced security measures along public transportation routes and around educational facilities, implementing recommendations that had been proposed but neglected before the murders. Community forums were organized to discuss broader issues of youth safety and the importance of reporting suspicious behavior, with Detective Davis and other law enforcement officials providing practical guidance while being careful not to promote unnecessary fear. The psychological impact of the crimes and subsequent trial varied widely across different segments of the Phoenix community. Parents of teenagers reported continuing anxiety about their children's safety, with many still implementing heightened security measures despite Wilson's incarceration. Students at East Valley Community College expressed relief at the verdicts, but noted that the campus atmosphere remained changed, with many avoiding studying alone or using the facilities where the victims had been targeted. Mental health professionals throughout the metropolitan area reported increased requests for counseling related to anxiety, grief, and trauma, particularly among young people who identified with the victims and families struggling to balance safety concerns with allowing their children appropriate independence. As the sentencing date approached, the probation department prepared a pre-sentence report for Judge Mendez, including victim impact statements, assessments of Wilson's criminal history, and potential for rehabilitation, and recommendations regarding sentencing options within the statutory framework. Katherine Mitchell met with the victims' families to prepare them for the sentencing hearing, explaining the procedures and helping them craft impact statements that would convey the full magnitude of their loss while maintaining the dignity they had demonstrated throughout the proceedings. The prosecution would recommend 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, one for each victim, plus an additional term for the predatory pattern of behavior. The maximum possible sentence under Arizona law, since Mitchell had elected not to pursue the death penalty. Thomas Reynolds, fulfilling his ethical obligation to advocate for his client, despite the overwhelming evidence and unanimous verdicts, prepared arguments for concurrent rather than consecutive sentences, citing Wilson's lack of prior criminal history and presenting psychological evaluations suggesting that treatment might be possible in a controlled environment. This approach faced significant challenges, given the premeditated nature of the crimes, the vulnerability of the victims, and Wilson's apparent lack of remorse. But Reynolds was bound by professional duty to present the best possible case for mitigation. Wilson himself showed little interest in these preparations, declining to provide input for the pre-sentence report and expressing no desire to address the court at sentencing, further reinforcing the impression of profound detachment that had characterized his demeanor throughout the proceedings. 2 days before the scheduled sentencing, an unexpected development briefly reignited media attention when a 34-page handwritten document purporting to be Wilson's explanation for his crimes was discovered in his cell during a routine security check. The document, which detention officers immediately turned over to prosecutors and defense counsel, contained disturbing elaborations on the motivations hinted at in his journal, explicitly connecting his murders to perceived rejections and humiliations he had experienced throughout his life. Most chillingly, it revealed that the burner phone placed with Gabriella Martinez had been intended as the first in a series of signature objects that would eventually spell out a message across multiple victims, a plan interrupted by his arrest. Judge Mendez ruled that this document could be considered during sentencing as evidence of Wilson's state of mind, but would not be read in open court or released to the public, balancing the legal relevance of the material against concerns about causing additional trauma to the victims' families or providing Wilson with the platform for notoriety he apparently sought. When the sentencing hearing finally arrived, the courtroom was once again filled to capacity, with an atmosphere even more solemn than during the trial itself. The proceedings began with victim impact statements, powerful testimonies to the lives that had been lost and the ongoing suffering of those left behind. James Adams spoke of coaching his son's first baseball team, of Tyler's determination to overcome a learning disability to excel academically, of college recruitment letters arriving in the mail for months after his murder. Patricia Thompson played a recording of her daughter's cello performance from her final recital, the haunting melody bringing tears to the eyes of even seasoned courtroom personnel before speaking of the silence that now filled her home where music had once been constant. Roberto and Elena Martinez addressed the court together, alternating between Spanish and English as they described Gabriella's journey from curious child to determined young scholar, showing photographs of her volunteer work and reading excerpts from her application essay for the medical internship she never had the chance to begin. Following these powerful statements, Katherine Mitchell presented the state's sentencing recommendation, emphasizing the calculated nature of the crimes, the vulnerability of the victims, and Wilson's apparent lack of remorse as aggravating factors justifying the maximum possible penalty. She referenced the document found in Wilson's cell as evidence of his continuing danger to society and his perception of the murders as achievements rather than crimes, arguing that consecutive life sentences were necessary to ensure he would never have the opportunity to act on these disturbed compulsions again. Mitchell concluded by returning one final time to the burner phone that had initiated the investigation, noting the irony that Wilson's attempt to leave a signature had instead secured his permanent removal from society. Thomas Reynolds presented a brief argument for concurrent rather than consecutive sentences, acknowledging the heinous nature of the crimes, but suggesting that Wilson's lack of prior criminal history and the possibility of mental health treatment during incarceration should be considered mitigating factors. His presentation was necessarily limited by Wilson's refusal to express remorse or accept responsibility, leaving Reynolds with few viable arguments for leniency. When Judge Mendez asked Wilson if he wished to address the court before sentencing, as was his right, Wilson initially declined but then unexpectedly changed his mind, rising slowly to deliver the only statement he would make throughout the entire proceedings. "The phone was just the beginning," Wilson said, his voice flat and his gaze directed somewhere above the heads of those present, rather than at the judge or the victims' families. "None of you understand what I was trying to build. None of you see what I see." With these cryptic words, he returned to his seat, leaving a disturbed silence in his wake. Judge Mendez paused for several moments, the courtroom entirely still, as he considered both the formal arguments and the disturbing glimpse into Wilson's thinking that had just been revealed. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of complete certainty in the justice he was about to deliver. "Henry Wilson, you have been found guilty by a jury of your peers of 3 counts of first-degree murder, 3 counts of kidnapping, and 1 count of predatory criminal conduct. These verdicts are supported by overwhelming evidence and reflect the calculated, deliberate nature of your actions in taking the lives of 3 young people of exceptional promise." Judge Mendez looked directly at Wilson, who finally met his gaze. "The court has considered all relevant factors, including the heinous nature of these crimes, the vulnerability of the victims, your apparent lack of remorse, and the danger you would pose to society if ever released. It is therefore the judgment and sentence of this court that you be committed to the Arizona Department of Corrections for 4 terms of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, to be served consecutively rather than concurrently." As Judge Mendez explained the technical details of the sentence and the defendant's right to appeal, Elena Martinez closed her eyes and whispered a prayer, her husband's arm around her shoulders, providing silent support. James and Susan Adams clasped hands tightly, while Patricia Thompson reached over to touch Gabriella's mother's hand in a gesture of shared understanding. The 3 families, united by unimaginable tragedy, received the sentence with quiet dignity, the legal conclusion providing a measure of closure, while fully acknowledging that no punishment could truly compensate for their loss. As Wilson was led from the courtroom for the final time, Roberto Martinez stood, his voice clear as he called out, "Gabriella, descansa en paz." The simple statement, "Gabriella, rest in peace," echoed what all the families felt, that justice, while necessary, was only one step in their ongoing journey through grief. Outside the courthouse, as the Arizona sun cast long shadows across the plaza, Katherine Mitchell stood with Detective Marcus Davis for a brief final statement to the assembled media. Today marks the end of a legal process, but the impact of these crimes will continue to reverberate through our community for years to come, she said. We hope these sentences provide some measure of closure for the Adams, Thompson, and Martinez families, and reassurance to the citizens of Phoenix that the person responsible for these terrible acts will never again walk free among us. As the cameras captured this concluding chapter of the legal saga, Davis added his own reflection. This case began with a single clue, a burner phone placed in a victim's hand. Today it ends with justice secured not just for Gabriella, but for Tyler and Michelle as well. Their memories will live on long after the man who took their lives is forgotten. In the months following Henry Wilson's sentencing, the city of Phoenix gradually began to heal from the wounds inflicted by his crimes, though the process was neither uniform nor complete. The physical reminders of the tragedy, memorial benches installed at East Valley Community College, enhanced security lighting along bus routes, additional emergency call boxes in campus parking lots, became integrated into the landscape, permanent alterations to the community's infrastructure that served both practical and symbolic purposes. Less visible, but equally significant, were the psychological changes. Parents who continued to track their teenagers' movements through smartphone apps, students who traveled in groups even in previously unconcerning situations, and a generalized awareness of vulnerability that had not existed before the summer when 3 promising young lives had been so brutally extinguished. The Adams, Thompson, and Martinez families each navigated their grief in different ways, though they maintained the connection that had formed during the investigation and trial. James and Susan Adams established the Tyler Adams Baseball Scholarship, which provided equipment and league fees for underprivileged youth showing academic promise, combining their son's athletic passion with his commitment to education. Patricia Thompson channeled her energy into expanding the music education program, where Michelle had volunteered, securing grant funding to provide instruments and instruction to children in underserved communities. Roberto and Elena Martinez, guided by their faith and supported by their church community, created a mentorship program for first-generation college aspirants, helping other young people pursue the dreams that Gabriella had embodied. 4 months after the sentencing, these separate initiatives were formally united under the umbrella of the Promise Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting educational opportunities, safety awareness, and grief counseling for families affected by violent crime. The Foundation's first major event, a candlelight vigil marking 1 year since the murders, drew over 2,000 attendees to a Phoenix park where photographs of Tyler, Michelle, and Gabriella were displayed alongside scholarship recipients and student performers who represented the future their killers had tried to extinguish. Mayor Sandra Reynolds, who had faced criticism during the initial investigation for perceived inadequacies in the city's response, delivered a moving speech acknowledging both the tragedy and the resilience demonstrated by the community in its aftermath. 1 year ago, our city was paralyzed by fear as a predator moved among us, targeting our brightest young people and devastating 3 families, Reynolds told the assembled crowd. Today we stand together not only in remembrance of Tyler, Michelle, and Gabriella, but in celebration of the legacies they inspired. Through the Promise Foundation, their spirit of achievement, service, and potential lives on, in every student who receives a scholarship, every child who learns to play an instrument, every first-generation college applicant who finds mentorship and support. The mayor's words captured the delicate balance the community continued to navigate, honoring the victims without allowing their murders to define them, acknowledging the trauma while refusing to let it dominate the city's future. Henry Wilson, prisoner number 789523 in the Arizona State Penitentiary, adjusted to incarceration with the same detached adaptation he had shown throughout his trial. Assigned to a maximum security unit due to the notoriety of his crimes, he was kept separate from the general population for his own protection, a common practice for offenders whose crimes involved children or teenagers. Prison records indicated that he was a compliant inmate who spent most of his time reading science fiction novels from the prison library and writing in journals that were regularly reviewed by prison staff due to concerns about their potential content. Psychiatric evaluations conducted during his first year of incarceration reinforced the disturbing psychological profile that had emerged during the trial. A combination of narcissistic personality traits, profound emotional detachment, and an unwavering belief in his intellectual superiority to both his victims and those who had brought him to justice. Katherine Mitchell, whose meticulous prosecution had secured Wilson's conviction, received numerous accolades for her handling of the case, including Prosecutor of the Year from the Arizona Bar Association and a Distinguished Service Award from the National District Attorneys Association. While appreciative of this professional recognition, Mitchell consistently redirected attention to the investigative team led by Detective Marcus Davis, whose methodical work following the discovery of the burner phone had built the foundation for the successful prosecution. In a profile published in the Arizona Republic 6 months after the sentencing, Mitchell reflected on the case that had defined her career. The burner phone was both Wilson's signature and his undoing. He believed it demonstrated his cleverness, but it actually revealed his fundamental misconception that his intelligence made him untouchable. In reality, it provided the first thread that, when pulled by dedicated investigators, unraveled his entire plan. Detective Davis continued his work with the Phoenix Police Department's homicide unit, though colleagues noted that the Wilson case had affected him more deeply than he publicly acknowledged. The meticulous investigation he had led became a case study used in training programs throughout Arizona and neighboring states, with particular emphasis on the digital forensic techniques that had transformed a single piece of physical evidence, the burner phone, into a comprehensive web connecting the perpetrator to all 3 murders. Davis occasionally gave presentations at law enforcement conferences about the case, always focusing on the investigative methodology rather than the sensational aspects that tended to dominate media coverage. When asked in an interview about the most important lesson from the investigation, Davis offered a perspective that reflected his experienced pragmatism. Technology creates new ways to commit crimes, but it also leaves digital breadcrumbs that can't be completely erased. Wilson thought he was using burner phones to avoid detection, but in reality, he was creating a digital signature that ultimately led us straight to him. East Valley Community College, which had served as the connecting point for all 3 victims and the hunting ground for their killer, implemented comprehensive security reforms in the aftermath of the murders. Background checks for all employees, including maintenance and support staff, were significantly enhanced, with particular attention to gaps in employment history and verification of all references. Security cameras were installed throughout the campus, especially in previously unmonitored areas like service corridors and maintenance access points where Wilson had moved unnoticed. Most significantly, the college established a mandatory buddy system for students using facilities during evening hours, created dedicated safe walking routes illuminated by blue security lights, and provided free transportation services for students traveling between the main campus and satellite locations. Dr. Jennifer Ramirez, whose digital forensic testimony had been crucial in securing Wilson's conviction, published a peer-reviewed paper on the case titled Digital Breadcrumbs: How Burner Phone Analysis Solved the Phoenix Serial Murders. The paper, which became required reading in forensic science programs nationwide, detailed the technical methodologies used to extract GPS data, recover deleted information, and establish connections between seemingly anonymous devices. Dr. Ramirez was careful to balance the educational value of sharing these techniques with ethical considerations about privacy and due process, emphasizing throughout that digital forensic evidence must be collected and analyzed with rigorous adherence to constitutional protections and chain of custody protocols. Her work contributed to advancing the field while ensuring that future investigations would benefit from the lessons learned in the Wilson case. The media coverage of the murders and subsequent trial evolved over time, initially focusing on the sensational aspects of the crimes before gradually shifting toward more thoughtful examination of their broader implications. National news magazines produced in-depth features exploring how Wilson had exploited his position as maintenance staff to move invisibly through spaces where his victims felt safe, raising questions about who receives scrutiny in shared public environments and who remains effectively invisible. True crime podcasts analyze the psychological aspects of the case with particular attention to the significance of the burner phone as both evidence and symbol. Documentary filmmakers approached the victims' families about participation in projects examining the impact of the crimes on the Phoenix community, though most of these requests were declined, with the families preferring to focus on the positive legacies they were building rather than revisiting the traumatic details of their children's deaths. Perhaps the most meaningful legacy emerged not from official initiatives or media coverage, but from the organic response of young people throughout Phoenix who had seen themselves reflected in Tyler, Michelle, and Gabriella. College and high school students across the city formed safety awareness groups, developed buddy systems for traveling after dark, and created peer support networks for processing feelings of vulnerability and fear. Many incorporated volunteer work into their academic schedules, explicitly connecting these efforts to the service ethic demonstrated by the 3 victims during their lives. When interviewed about these activities, student leaders frequently referenced the Promise Foundation's motto, adapted from a line in Gabriella Martinez's college application essay, "The future belongs to those who build it together." This sentiment, expressing both optimism and collective responsibility, captured the constructive response that had gradually emerged from the community's grief. On the second anniversary of Wilson's sentencing, Roberto and Elena Martinez visited Gabriella's grave in a small cemetery on the outskirts of Phoenix, bringing fresh flowers and spending several hours sitting beside the polished granite headstone engraved with their daughter's name and the dates that encompassed her too brief life. They were joined later by James and Susan Adams and Patricia Thompson, the shared pilgrimage having become an annual tradition for the 3 families united by tragedy. No media were present for this private commemoration, but Roberto later shared with a community newsletter that the families had read aloud letters from scholarship recipients describing their educational journeys and future plans. "We bring these letters to our children," he explained, "to show them that their dreams continue through others, that the future they imagined is still being built, even if they cannot be here to see it." The case file for the state of Arizona versus Henry Wilson was officially closed, the appeals process exhausted after the Arizona Supreme Court unanimously upheld both the convictions and sentences. The physical evidence, including the burner phone found with Gabriella Martinez that had initiated the investigation, remained in storage at the Phoenix Police Department's evidence facility, preserved according to protocols for cases resulting in life sentences. In the digital age, however, the case lived on through academic studies, law enforcement training programs, and the collective memory of a community permanently altered by both the horror of the crimes and the resilience demonstrated in their aftermath. The 3 young victims, remembered not for how they died, but for how they had lived and for the potential they had embodied, became symbols of promise, interrupted, but not extinguished, their legacies continuing through the lives touched by the foundation established in their names. 5 years after the murders, as Phoenix continued its process of healing and remembrance, Dr. Eleanor Patel, the forensic psychologist who had testified about Wilson's psychology during the trial, published a comprehensive analysis of his case in the Journal of Criminal Psychology. Her article included a final observation that many found particularly insightful. The burner phone placed in Gabriella Martinez's hand represented Wilson's fundamental misunderstanding of his own significance. He believed it was a signature announcing his power and control, but it ultimately revealed his profound insignificance compared to the lives he extinguished. Tyler Adams, Michelle Thompson, and Gabriella Martinez are remembered for their achievements, potential, and the positive impact they had on others during their brief lives. Wilson is remembered only as the obstacle they never had the chance to overcome, a footnote in the continuing stories of the futures he tried and failed to erase. This perspective that Wilson had failed in his apparent goal of achieving significance through destruction was reflected in the community's evolution from fear to determined resilience. The Promise Foundation expanded its programs to include preventative initiatives addressing the social isolation and resentment that had fueled Wilson's crimes, recognizing that addressing root causes was as important as supporting victims. Campus security protocols developed in response to the murders were adopted by educational institutions throughout Arizona and neighboring states, potentially preventing similar tragedies. The buddy system created by students at East Valley Community College evolved into a smartphone app used by thousands of young people across the Southwest, allowing friends to virtually accompany each other during late-night walks or in unfamiliar areas. The Martinez family, who had lost their daughter to a killer's resentment of her potential, witnessed the first recipient of the Gabriella Martinez Medical Scholarship graduate from the University of Arizona Medical School and begin a residency program focusing on providing care to underserved communities, the very path Gabriella had hoped to follow. At the white coat ceremony marking this milestone, Elena Martinez placed her daughter's stethoscope around the young doctor's neck, a tangible passing of the dream from one generation to the next. Patricia Thompson attended the debut performance of the Michelle Thompson Memorial Orchestra, composed entirely of young musicians from the program her daughter had supported through volunteer teaching. James Adams coached the Tyler Adams Memorial Baseball team to the state championship, guided by his son's philosophy that athletic excellence and academic achievement could and should go hand in hand. These positive developments could not erase the tragedy that had occurred, nor could they fully heal the grief experienced by the families and the broader community. The enhanced security measures, while necessary and effective, served as constant reminders of vulnerability that had not been acknowledged before the murders. Parents throughout Phoenix continued to experience heightened anxiety about their teenagers' safety, reflecting a fundamental shift in the community's sense of security that would likely never completely return to its pre-crime state. The annual memorial events, while evolving to emphasize hope and resilience rather than loss, still centered around 3 lives cut short by senseless violence, 3 futures that existed only in imagination rather than reality. Yet within this complex legacy of both trauma and healing, the city of Phoenix demonstrated a capacity for transformation that transcended the acts that had initially devastated it. The burner phone that Henry Wilson had placed in Gabriella Martinez's hand as a signature of his perceived power had indeed communicated a message, though not the one he intended. Rather than announcing his significance, it had ultimately revealed the profound connections between victims, families, investigators, prosecutors, and community members who had come together in pursuit of justice and remembrance. The technology meant to establish Wilson's control had instead empowered those seeking to hold him accountable, while the lives he had attempted to erase continued to inspire others long after he had been confined to the obscurity of incarceration. As Phoenix approached the 10-year mark since the summer that had changed it forever, the visible scars had largely healed, though the underlying tissue would never be quite the same. New generations of students moved through East Valley Community College, many unaware of the specific events that had shaped the security protocols they followed as matter of routine. The Promise Foundation's annual fundraising gala became one of the city's premier charitable events, supporting dozens of scholarships and community safety initiatives. The memorial benches dedicated to Tyler, Michelle, and Gabriella were well-maintained but increasingly integrated into the campus landscape, places where students gathered to study, socialize, and imagine futures as bright as those once envisioned by the young people they commemorated. In the end, the most profound legacy of the case may have been the demonstration that while a single individual's destructive actions can cause immeasurable pain, the collective response of a community determined to honor rather than avenge, to build rather than destroy, and to remember rather than forget, ultimately proves more powerful and enduring. The burner phone that had initiated the investigation leading to Wilson's capture and conviction, a device designed to be temporary and disposable, had ironically created permanent connections between the lives touched by these crimes and the futures they continued to inspire. In this transformation of tragedy into purpose, Phoenix had not only survived its darkest chapter, but had written new ones defined not by fear but by the promise reflected in the lives of Tyler Adams, Michelle Thompson, and Gabriella Martinez, lives that, though ended too soon, continued to illuminate paths forward for those who followed.